Well, the good news is none of that will be recorded. So, first of all, can we deal with the planning application? I don't think I need to deal with apologies for absence. You were rather all here last time, and you should be. And it doesn't look like anybody who wasn't. And as we know, the members of Development Control are going to go. Thank you. And they'll come back when we finish dealing with paper B. Paper B, the position we got to, as members will hopefully remember, is that we had the officer presentation, we had the applicant give a presentation. I've said to the applicant I want him at the front, just in case anything arises, because we want to make sure that we have in the front of our minds what he said, as well as what the officers have said. Obviously, we can ask the officers again, but if he wasn't there, we wouldn't be able to ask him. And he has suggested putting around his comments, which I hope you'll find is favourable, because it just focuses our minds again. The position is that we looked at what the issues were, and I suggested to you there were two issues. One was, can it be developed safely in relation to the contamination issue? And to some extent, it appeared when we were here on Thursday that had been blocked off as a major problem. And then secondly, are there reasons for saying there should be an exception to the policy, or is the committee going to say there should be no exception to the policy? But either way round, the Development Control Committee hadn't addressed that issue, and we need to, and that's why it's come to us. Can I just tell you that Mr. Townsend has told me that the officers would like to address us on, and obviously take questions, of course, because Councillor Harvey raised one or two points about applications where being granted and conditions in relation to contamination being put in relation to the application. I believe officers want to say a bit more about that with a view to saying that actually it is an outstanding issue that they think is still important. And then we as a committee can take a view on whether we think it is still important, or whether it's something they'll just have to get over as officers and deal with should DC approve it, or whether we want to tell DC you need to get your head around that as well, even though that's not necessarily the same as the main issue. So Mr. Townsend first, and then we'll just deal with the contamination issue we can first, and then we'll move back on to the other policy reasons, please. So Mr. Townsend.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it was just really to clarify a couple of points made at the last meeting. Mr. Beale comment on two specific points which are quite technical in terms of the reference that was made to the triple membrane and the Newnham site, which I think Councillor Godison from memory raised in the public speaking. But it was just on the issue of conditions and why in this instance we feel that a condition couldn't be established, because as Councillor Harvey pointed out quite rightly, we do have a standard, if you like, contaminated land condition, which we do impose on applications where they're for new sensitive uses such as residential uses. The issue in this particular instance is that the historic nature of the use and the potential for contamination is so significant that, if you like, we haven't got to the point where there's enough comfort for us to be able to impose a condition in the first place. So what we're seeking from the applicant is some information up front, in terms of in the sense of a site survey, to allow us to then apply a condition. If we don't have that, then in our view, it's not reasonable at this time to impose a condition until such time as we have that sort of first level, if you like, of information. As I say, Mr. Beale just explained now on the two more technical points of the triple membrane.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, as I say, at the meeting on Thursday, the applicant stated that a gas membrane would address the potential contamination issues on the site. Obviously, I won't go into too much detail regarding chemistry and regarding contaminants, but on sites of this nature, there are many potential contaminants to consider. The membrane itself would only be located underneath the proposed dwelling on the footprint, essentially, and would not protect future occupiers of the application site from all contaminants across the entire site. For example, as a result of the brickworks, there could be contaminants such as heavy metals in the underlying soils. Future occupiers could be exposed to contaminants in their soft landscaping / garden areas, so the membrane wouldn't protect exposure to those. As Mike was saying, reference has also been made to another site in Newnham. On that site, the source of contamination was off-site, approximately 150 metres away. In that instance, a gas membrane was acceptable as the only remedial technique that was required. However, on this site, the circumstances are totally different, in that the potential sources of contamination are on site, on the application site, and a gas membrane would possibly be required on its own, would not be sufficient to prevent unacceptable risks to future occupiers.
ask, what's the position as regarding the local authority if the application proceeds without knowing the dangers in advance? What are the potential risks?
I mean, there is a potential that we could designate the land as statutory contaminated land in the future, but obviously that's often, I can't say for certain at this stage. There's so many unknowns with this site that, as Mike was saying, we need the information up front to make a more robust judgment for granting planning permission.
Councillor Harvey wants to say something. Councillor Watts, your hand was moving before we touched this. Was it on this, or because if it's not on contamination?
No, I thought contamination had been dealt with when you asked a very direct question and didn't get a direct answer last time. But I want to talk about policy.
It's Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about both, but we'll get to the policy in a minute. In terms of the contamination, thank you for your explanation. As a committee, we're supposed to scrutinise what the DC committee did and come to a judgment as to whether you think it's a sound decision. I mean, that's the whole point of the scrutiny process being referred here. The consistency side of that is really important then. There have been applications where we have given permission to applicants who have proposed exactly the same thing, membranes, exactly the same thing, where we have not known the full extent of the contamination, where we have allowed them to present evidence later, and where we have allowed them, in effect, not to give us the full picture. And I'm thinking of Lemon Land, and I'm thinking of the Eli Lilly. And only this last week, in fact, I was looking at those reports for a different matter. Extensive reports covering heavy metals, benzenes, arsenics, asbestos, and the rest of it, that the Development Control Committee said could quite happily be dealt with under a condition that the officers was discharged in due course. But all the information wasn't presented. So I'm interested in consistency here. That's just one example I would give back to the officers. I respect what you say, but as a committee, we have to deal with consistency. And we have allowed this in the past, quite openly. And that was for a 500 home site, let alone a 1 home site. And the only point I would suggest in relation to the applicant, Chair, is that I doubt the applicant, as would anybody, would build a home over a contaminated site that would threaten to elderly downsized residents. I mean, they're not going to do that. That's just a stupid suggestion. So surely there is an appropriate method and process to go through that can achieve the aim that is required. And that is what has happened on lots of other applications.
Let's hear from the officers.
Chair, I mean, I'd fully take on board the points Councillor Harvey's made there. The issue really is the base position of the particular site in question. There could be different sites of different scales. The scale in itself isn't necessarily the issue. It's the specific of what's on this particular site, which is important. And the contaminated land officer has formed the view based on this specific site that the condition approach can't be taken forward at this time because of the level of information available. I do take the point, as I say, that there are other sites where condition has been imposed, but that I can only say is in different circumstances dependent on what is specifically or potentially specifically on this particular site. So the position from the contaminated land officer is that a condition couldn't be imposed on this particular occasion because of the site itself.
Can I just ask, the examples the councillor has given, on the face of it, seem pertinent to the point he's making. In those applications, were the officers aware of the likely contamination or potential for contamination as a result of some reports that have been prepared, even if they weren't in detail?
Yeah, that is correct. So with Eli Lilly, there's been an awful lot of site investigation undertaken over the years. So when the latest planning mission went in, we were able to form a basis on that to an extent.
Do you want to come back on that? Because I just want to get to the bottom of whether this is a showstopper or not, which was my original question. Because if it is, we need to discuss where we go with it. If it isn't, we'll move swiftly on again.
And that's fair. I don't want to labour the point. I really don't. I would just suggest that in terms of what the officer has said, it isn't the only example. For me, it's process, it's consistency, and it's standards. If we've applied it in one way in one case, that it's it should be applied across all. You can't just pick and choose. If a condition or if a process can be achieved on one site to that scale, surely it can be applied on this. It just seems illogical where the office is coming from in the comparison of the two sites, really. But I don't want to labour the point. I don't think it's worth labouring compared to the policy points that we should be discussing.
So, Ms. James.
I'd quite like to labour the point in the sense that We've got members of Norden at the moment that are gravely concerned, who met with us last week about the contamination. We knew that site was contaminated, and when it went to appeal, we produced a document that outlined this. Now, I think tonight, if we use this example as a reason to turn this down, I think it is incredibly dangerous for us as a process. If that is the case, bring it on. Because I think that, you know, in relation to the application for Sentinel housing, in relation to that site, I think you're setting a precedent. And if that is what you're saying, because I can assure you there are members of the ward of Norden who have done an enormous amount of work in relation to the contamination of that land. And it is exceptionally detailed. So I will be very interested tonight if this is the reason why this application is rejected.
Thank you, Councillor Mr. James. So following on from your logic, what you're saying is the other application shouldn't have been turned down for contamination, and maybe this shouldn't because conditions can be applied. That's what I'm trying to get to. Or are you saying the other, I don't want to go into the details of the other application, but are you saying that if it's so important in that, it should have stopped it, and therefore it is important in this, so it should stop this? Because you see what I mean? I know about consistency, but what is the right answer? It's very easy to say we've got to be the same as what we did before, but at the same time you seem to be suggesting that was wrong. So if it was wrong, do we write it now, or if it's not wrong, then we can move on?
Just to say, I mean, the Lily site is actually included in the very documents we're looking at in the allocations because it's within the urban area. It's promoted for 500 unit development. So if you're talking about contamination and consistency of application, the officers are recommending that for residential use. And we haven't dealt with contamination issues on that site yet, not 1 inch, not 1 inch. So again, I don't think it is an issue, I really don't, and I think it can be resolved because there are double standards going on here. It's being applied in one case in one way and not in another, in a very site that we're considering this evening.
Ms. Brimacombe.
Sorry, I just want to, because I think we are talking about the same thing but in different ways. As I understand it, what the officers have said is that the Eli Lilly site, we have carried, there has been a lot of reports done already on the contaminants on that site, and that's why it's possible to consider that application and condition it because you know what is on that site.
Forgive me, Karen, the actual reports say that there is a significant proportion of the site that is unknown. We do not know what is on that site. That's what the environmental reports say.
No, the residential report was for...
Just a minute, come on, the pair of you. Firstly, one through me, please, and the other one not to each other. Thank you.
Sorry, Chair. The point being that we're digressing because the point is it's about this gentleman's application. It's not about Eli Lilly. The point is about the consistency of the officer's application here. That's the only...
Thank you. Well, I think we should be consistent when we look at contamination, and we should take it seriously on all sites. So I don't think the fact that something has slipped through where the contamination issue has not been addressed properly is any excuse for not dealing with it here. Thank you.
Well, members, I think we need to cross this bridge, so let's cross it. Those members who feel that this is an issue that can be resolved through conditions and therefore we don't need to word anything that would go back to DC saying sort this out before you go anywhere else, stick up your hands. And those who feel it is a showstopper and we ought to be sending wording back to DC, stick up your hands. Right, well, there we are. It's a bridge we've crossed. The majority think we shouldn't be going back to DC on this. Let's move on to policy, please. Right, Councillor Watts had my eye first.
Thank you, Chairman. I really think we've spent enough time on this, and in order to bring the debate to something specific, I would like to propose an alternative recommendation, which is the application is permissible because it relates to use of previously developed land, also known as a brownfield site, reference MPPF clause 111. There's a long history in this committee of me being told by a senior officer that government documents don't mean what they say in plain English, and I hope that's not going to continue. But the MPPF in 3 places says a brownfield site is previously developed land. We know this is previously developed land because the report tells us it's a former brickworks, and therefore that policy item is sufficient for it to go back to DC and allow them to pass it if they want to. But whatever else that DC want to do is up to them, isn't it? Because it's the policy issue that's brought here. So I so move. It's very short, but I've got it written down if you want it.
That's fair enough. Do you have a seconder for that? And then we can amend, adjust it, and work with it. Councillor Harvey. Okay.
All right.
I want to make sure that what you're suggesting, we've discussed and make sure that the wording is accurate in terms of the officer's understanding and our understanding like asking what's the word available mean. We now need to know what the word previously means, because as we would understand it, a brownfield site would be a site that would previously been developed, but may mean that it has lain empty, but it's still technically a brownfield site. Yes. Does that then have to, from that moment, still be a brownfield site up until the moment that it is the application comes in? Because of course it's arguable that it is no longer, many brownfield sites refer back to open countryside, and I think that's the potential area of dispute, and we've got to iron that one out, because if we pass or reject a resolution that's wrong in terms of, say, the law, but it's planning law really, then if that'd be the wrong thing to do. We just got to get it right. So could I ask the officers, what's the state of play for what obviously was brownfield, would be regarded brownfield, except it probably ceased before any of these Acts of Parliament and various definitions came into force. And then can brownfield become open countryside again? Yes or no, please?
Thank you, Chair. I know that the last meeting, Councillor Watts raised this with regards to the references that were previously in PPS 3, I think, in terms of talking about what previously developed land was defined as in that document. And I mentioned that the issues about abandonment and the fact that the use was there historically but is no longer there now. Just to supplement that, I mean, the definition of previously developed land now taken forward in the MPPF specifically sets out that this excludes land that was previously developed where the remains of the permanent structure or fixed surface structure have blended into the landscape in the process of time, which in my view that would describe this particular site.
Sorry, could I have the reference in MPPF for that?
So it's in Annex 2 of the glossary.
Have a look at that, because I think it's important. Do you want to withdraw or withdraw your motion, but perhaps have a think about rewording it?
Well,
If you're keen to nudge this in one direction, you might want to use different words.
well, I think precisely what I've quoted is the case, but I have to accept that if there's another part of the same document that redefines it, then I'll have to withdraw it.
Have a think if you're moving that way. Right, we've dealt with that. It's clearly not brownfield, but it used to be brownfield. Or it's previously developed, but it's actually gone back to open countryside. And it's the question of the extent of that and the timescale on it. Do we have any idea of when it was a brickworks last?
It's approximately 1920, 1930. From historic maps, that is. They're only a snapshot in time, but...
How long the brickworks went on?
No, I don't know. No.
Right, any other cases? Councillor Gary Watt.
Chair, discussing policy, I just think our policy building in the countryside is too rigid, especially when its areas are outside the settlement boundary. A plot similar to this within the settlement boundary would get the go-ahead, it would get 3 or 4 homes on it and we wouldn't blink an eyelid. It seems when somebody in the countryside wants to put a bit of growth into the economy, we have all these barriers stuck up. So I think we should be more flexible policy, quite frankly, and I think it touches on what we were debating last week. There could be potential for homes to be built in rural areas, so your little hamlets where people like this could come forward, and if there's no objections from neighbours and parish councils, I think we should have a policy of letting it go ahead, quite frankly.
Councillor Watts, do you want to see if you can articulate? No. That's the theory, but we've got to. We're with the existing policy that we have at the moment. If you want to articulate an exception, for instance, you appreciate the existing policy recognises that in many villages you've got a house and you've got a few fields, you've got another house and a few fields, and you can't, because there's no settlement policy boundary. The policy protects that open countryside around those houses from being all joined up and developed. And arguably it's that same policy, I'm sure you can see where I'm going, that is protecting the countryside around the applicant's house. Now, if you want to say that there's an exception, you'll have to come up with the explanation as to why. Bear in mind, at the last committee, I did sort of flag up one or two potentials for you to think about.
Just conscious of what was said to us last time round. I mean, from my understanding, we have an incoming policy that hasn't yet been adopted that would allow flexibility, and we have an outgoing saved policy. So we should give weight to the fact that it's saved, and we should give weight to the fact that it's incoming, and find a balance between the two. That would be an appropriate way forward with an application that falls at the time that it does. In terms of actual specific reasons, I understand or I believe that the actual proposal lies within an existing residential curtilage and attaches to a road that has residential units already off of it. Therefore, it would join a residential road, it would join a residential community. It isn't technically, in terms of actually where it is, building in the countryside. It is building within a village in a context, and that context is existing residential units and existing residential development. So on that basis, I would find an exception. I'd find an exception also in terms of need established and local need established in terms of the applicant and what they've said in relation to local need. That's a weaker argument, I think, in comparison to the first one, but nonetheless the one that could be put. And finally, and the weakest of all three, I guess, would be consistency in comparison to previous decisions. Development Control recently took a decision to allow a residential unit in open countryside without challenge from officers. It hasn't come here to my knowledge, and that was at the last Development Control meeting that I sat on less than, I think it was just before Christmas. So on that basis, we already have an example, another example if you like, let alone the others that have been cited, because it's not the only one, where we have allowed exceptions and we have allowed residential development in the countryside if the officers wish to stick to that particular argument. And that hasn't been challenged. That's the important point, Chair. It's not been brought to this committee as a challenge from the officers.
Reasons for exception you're suggesting are that firstly, the plot lies within the existing residential curtilage.
Again, my understanding from the case officer's comments is that it doesn't actually sit within the residential curtilage, it is on adjoining land. I mean, the issue of curtilage is always quite difficult, and I'll be honest, is matter of fact and degree as to where curtilage does or doesn't lie. But my understanding from the officer's interpretation, and having her visited the site, is that the land is adjoining the residential curtilage, not part of the residential curtilage.
Sounds, when you look at it though, it does look like part of the garden. Yes, well, residential curtilage, most people call it garden, except if they want to build a house on it. Then it becomes open countryside. But okay, I mean, the grass is mown to lawn, isn't it? Yes. Okay, so the first reason Councillor Harvey is within existing residential curtilage or garden of the adjoining property. It's on a residential road. There's no dispute about that, I'm sure. The site is between other residential properties. And the fourth reason seems to be what I think you might be saying, is that access to this plot is through the residential curtilage of the neighbouring property and not specifically regarded as open countryside. Do you want to comment on?
my understanding, Chair, was that the access is to be taken from the lane itself. Not, I understand the intentions of the applicant with regards to it being for family members, but it would still be seen as a standalone independent residential dwelling.
Is it? I think what might be suggested is the plot is just a minute. The plot is surrounded by the residential curtilage of the neighbouring property, and is not standalone or adjoining open countryside.
From a factual point of view, then yes, that would be the case.
Reasons that I've heard coming from around the committee. Firstly, does anyone want to add any other reasons for exception? And then would someone like to propose those reasons? And then perhaps we'll have a debate because other people might take a contrary view. So first of all, Councillor Tilbury, do you want to comment on those 4 reasons, add to them to begin with? And if you want to debate them, we'll see. Or do you want to...
Basically, to add to it, I mean, to sort of background, I was on DC when the other 2 were passed that were sort of houses in the countryside that officers suggested should be refused. Both, funnily enough, were in the Basing ward. It seems to be a bit of an issue over there. But the point was, and certainly myself and Councillor and Mrs Tucker sort of argued that we don't have a policy for this, and it's gone back to this committee, which of course we weren't on, and really the committee should look at that and come up with a policy, whereas what they tend to do is, well, this one's okay and that one's okay, and it's a bit piecemeal. So I would suggest the committee needs to look at a policy to cover this, because if the argument is if local people haven't got a problem, and if you've got a problem, Basing is going to probably tell you they have got a problem, because they do have a rather large pressure group there, don't they? So I'm sure they would make it known if they had an issue with any of this there. So if the neighbours don't have a problem and there isn't an issue from the parish council, then it's probably acceptable, particularly at a time when we're looking for sites for houses. But the point I would make is that what it says in the NPPF is that local planning authorities should avoid new isolated homes in the countryside. Now, it doesn't say just new homes, it just says isolated homes. Now, if you're living where this one is, it isn't actually particularly isolated. My idea of isolated is sort of a mile up the road from anybody in the middle of a field somewhere. So I think that's potentially there as a way sort of that this particular one's acceptable there in that respect, but we do need to come up with a proper policy, because if we're going to just do each one piecemeal, it's going to take up a lot of committee time, not just at DC but coming back to this one. Well, I think this isn't an isolated home in the countryside. It's in the countryside because it's outside a settlement boundary, but it's not isolated. I think that's the point. And the other ones I think have been quite put by other people anyway.
Well, so would you be proposing that then? That on the end of those other 4? Just trying to get the thing going, you see. If we've got a motion, let's chug along and let's debate
sorry,
it.
I'd put that.
Yes,
put that
and someone
forward.
second that, then the 4 that I've summed up, and the 5th one that Councillor Tilbury. Councillor Harvey, thank you. Right, now we've got a motion on the table. Would others like to speak to it or against it or anything? Councillor Gardner?
I'd like to speak against it, I'm afraid. I agree with Ian that yes, our policy in terms of building around the villages does need review. However, it hasn't been yet. And I'd be interested if the officers could comment on the number of similar applications that have come through and been turned down because they've been against policy, for which the applicants have gone away and accepted that they are against policy and they couldn't go through. And for consistency, I think this one should be treated similarly. And looking at it, I cannot see that there are sufficient exceptional factors at this time for us to let this go ahead. There is talk that it is going to be used for elderly parents. Well, it will not be used by elderly parents in perpetuity. So what happens to the property when they die? It will be used by somebody else. It'll go back onto the open market, quite possibly. So that would worry me. So I am worried about creating precedents at this stage, which other people are going to come in on the back of. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just 2 small points to make in response and to add to what you've outlined as in the motion. The site is adjacent to residential development and it's not going to constitute an intrusion into the open countryside. I think that's a point of principle. And the site is on disturbed land and forms part of a previous historic developed use. It's already been developed. It is on already developed land. I think those two are very, very simple points that point to an exception, as you captured in the motion in your own words. So I think I support the motion and would recommend it to the committee.
Councillor Keith Watts.
I'd like to cite a precedent of an occasion in Whitchurch Ward, of course, where the officers accepted the Development Control Committee's decision without playing the do or die card, as I call this. And Development Control viewing panel came with me and looked at a site that was broken down sheds. And it was right next to the settlement policy boundary, and the other side of the fence was a nice green lawn surrounded by flowers. And I pointed out that these broken down sheds were the open countryside, and this green lawn was a brownfield site. And and I'm Napoleon Bonaparte. And I believe the Development Control Committee passed that application on the basis of common sense. And there is a precedent for common sense being applied to cases like this, and I think this is one where it should also be applied.
Any other councillors wanting to speak? Well, I'll just make a comment myself, which is, Councillor Peat.
Sorry, apologies. I just, the bit that I'm trying to get around my head, and perhaps it can be explained to me, is if we knew that it was a brick site, or former brick, and then, so we know that there's some potential for contamination. And if I'm, because the bit that concerns me is I'm still being told that that's really a showstopper. I know they're saying that there's potential for conditions, but over here we're saying there's not potential for conditions because it has to be dealt with and we have to know. If it is such a showstopper on a planning application, is that not something that should be submitted with the planning application so you're in a position to grant it? That's the bit I'm stuck with.
Well, I think we've looked at that already, haven't we? That's the answer. The officers are saying that they're very concerned about it. The committee has looked at it and takes a view that it can be resolved by conditions. And the officers are not telling us that it can't be. They're just saying their preferences. And the committee's taken a view that it agrees with them. You may disagree, but I'm afraid that's the majority of the committee. You'll have to take your own course in terms of the motion. The only point I would add is that it's a slightly hypothetical point, but Upnately doesn't seem to have a settlement policy boundary. If it did have one, I suspect the applicant's house, would be within it. And if it was within it, then the site would be within it, and then there'd be a presumption in favour of development. I know that's a series of what-ifs, because there isn't one, and the reason there isn't one is probably good reason for there not being one. But it's clearly it's in the centre of a village, very, very small village, and that's a point to bear in mind. Well, look, the 5 points have been listed in the motion by the proposer and seconder, Councillor Tilbury and Councillor Harvey. The site is within the existing residential curtilage or garden of the adjoining property. The site is on a residential road. The site is between other residential properties. The plot is surrounded by the residential curtilage of the neighbouring property and not a standalone site or adjoining open countryside. And fifthly, the site would not result in an isolated property in the open countryside. And the motion no doubt goes on to say, for these reasons, the application should be regarded as an exception to the current policies. All those in favour of that motion, please show your hands. And those against? Well, the motion is passed. So we'll send that back to Development Control and yes, of course, Councillor, and send that motion back to Development Control and see what they make of it. Well done, members. Next item is paper C. did we get up to? 6? Did we say?
Section 6, page 62.
Well, okay, I thought we'd passed on, Councillor Harvey's.
No, we have. I'd like to, through you,
Yes.
just put something on record.
Yes, go
Last
on then.
meeting, we discussed the table that had the 1,200 units that were within the urban area, that were within Basingstoke settlement policy boundary. I presume we're not going to debate that tonight, because that was what we debated, or should have got what to. If that's the case, can I, through you, invite the planning officers to arrange a meeting with us as the ward members to raise the issues of contamination on the Eli Lilly site? Because what has been said tonight concerns us greatly as ward members, and we need to realise that if you're going to keep it in the local plan.
Well, you seem to be keen that conditions can resolve things, so...
Precisely. So we,
Well,
need, to
there we
have
are.
these
I
we need to have these conversations. That's
Well,
the point.
I don't think I can instruct you. I'm sure you're perfectly capable of raising it with officers. Right, let's move on to item 6. Site assessment. Officers, thank you very much for attending tonight. You are free to go, and I should go. Site assessment, paragraph 6.1. I think perhaps we just want to cast our minds over 6.1 to 6.5. Bear in mind our discussions we had last time about, and obviously members expressed slightly different views on the approach, but they have been set out with the Basingstoke focus with a spread of development to larger settlements. So the order that we will be looking at will be Basingstoke, Bramley, Kingsclear, Oakley, Overton, Tadley, and then Whitchurch. And the assessment process effectively follows that down. Obviously, the many down site we'll look at shortly. And what I was proposing to do was to have our minds on, I think, page 63 of 172, where we will start with BAS 24 Swing Swang Lane, and hear from members if they've got any comments about the appropriateness of that site being included against the site assessment criteria. Obviously, if that site does not particularly cause us problems, then we'll move on to the next one. If it does, we'll take it as it goes through. Obviously, if members wish to ask officers questions about the site assessment criteria that's been applied, please feel free to do so. So I think that's where I'm going to start, with BAS 24 Swing Sand Lane, and Councillor Watts, on the process or just on that side? Yes. Okay, go back to 6.9.
Policies on housing register, identifying people in need. And we have 5 bands, but people in band 4 and 5, we write to them as an authority, say you're not going to get housed, basically. But we're using bands 1 to 4 as general needs here, so we've got inconsistency across the council. We've got the housing department telling residents you're not going to get housed because you're in bands 4 and 5. We have a policy here saying we're going to use this if you're in band 4 as a housing needs, and we're going to build homes. So I think we've got discrepancy there. Thank you.
So Miller, do you want to comment on that point, and then Mr. Hunter's getting
Absolutely,
geared up
that
to-
same paragraph, because we seem to be bouncing around using, we've got people here, 5,300 people. I also see in the same document that's used in the same context, but using the word households. That is a very different thing. What is it? Individuals or households? Because that alters the whole numbers game.
Just coming to the first point, in terms of the bands 1 to 4, there are obviously bands 1 to 5. In terms of objectively assessed need, the council should be trying to meet its needs. That's what we're supposed to do. Obviously, the housing department are limited by the amount of houses that are in the stock and in the supply. So make it clear to those who are at the upper ends, bands 4 and 5, that it may be more difficult to house them within particular time periods. In terms of the numbers of people on the waiting list, that may be individuals, but generally they relate to households. So it would be households. So it might be made up of 1 person or 2 or 3 people.
Councillor Miller?
So what is it? Because in the context that they're written, they mean different things. Do we delete people and put households? because that's different. Because I don't know if you averaged it out, how many people are involved.
We understand.
It's
What's
significant.
the answer? Go on, let's get the answer. What's it?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that it would be household. It would be household salt in particular.
Then I'll be coming back to this point as we move on, bearing that in mind.
James?
Thank you. I'd also like to pick up on 6.9, where it talks about 13,250 homes based on the provision of 40% affordable housing. Is that an assumption? Because in the presentations that we've been given by officers, they tell us that the affordable housing model isn't affordable and nobody on the register can afford that model. So is the assumption in what we're going to develop assuming that those people will be able to afford that model? Are we giving a guarantee here that we are going to house those people in housing need? Because that's what we're saying here. And I think if we're going to use a definition to justify a numbers game, we need to be very clear, because when it comes to Norden, when we get to the 40% affordable housing, if those people in Norden cannot afford to live in the housing that you're going to be building in my ward, I will be coming back and knocking on the door of this council. Is that what we're saying?
Explain the paragraph, Mr. Hunter, and if you want to explain what affordable means as well, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
This paragraph is simply a guide to members in terms of what you would achieve in terms of numbers of houses if you delivered at 40% related to that 5,300. So it's 5,300 is essentially the 40% of the 13,250. So it's essentially just giving you a guide to how many houses you might need to build if you wanted to meet full affordability.
Affordability meaning what? Because we often discuss this.
As members are well aware, our policy sets out in the current local plan what affordable housing definition is. It also sets out what we try to seek in terms of rents and intermediate housing. So those are clear policies. This makes no reference in here about affordability. This is simply just using it as an equation to demonstrate the kind of need you would have to build if you were to meet those needs.
Councillor Tilbury.
Thank you. Can I ask Andrew, in the figures you've used on there, the ones you've used through the chair, the figures you've used for Overton, and I assume the figures, this 5,300, that includes housing transfers. Now, if someone wants to transfer from one place to another, they actually create a vacancy. So the figures that were used for Overton are 115. 28 of those are transfers.
Yeah, general needs is alternative to transfers.
No, they're all the figures that I've got that are used for Overton just cover transfers are included within that.
Okay.
And this is where there's a lot of
Mr.
confusion.
Hunter?
Yeah, that's correct. They do include transfers, and those transfers are taken into account into those particular figures. Yeah.
Mr. James?
My understanding, I didn't attend the workshop that members were given in relation to how we came up with the number and how that came about. But what I understand is we were told that Whitchurch, for example, had this many people in the housing need, and therefore it equated that this is what was needed to be developed within Whitchurch. That's an assumption that whatever we build will assume that there will be a percentage of that will be affordable to meet that need and actually deliver the housing need for that Whitchurch. And what I've argued consistently, and what the Labour group has argued, is our policies at the moment don't stack up, and you are not going to be able to deliver socially rented housing to meet housing need. Now, if we are going to build housing in this borough, we need to ensure that we're building it to meet housing need. We have examples, and I've raised this with officers, that we built shared ownership over the last 4 years, and predominantly most of it housed people that were either working outside of and living outside of the borough. Now, if that's what you wish to do, that's fine. But I just really have real concerns that we're assuming, and it isn't going to stack up because of 106 agreements, that we're going to be able to deliver affordable housing to meet housing need. Now that, if you need to justify why you want to build housing, that's fine, but you are not going to be able to house people off the register when you're building this number of housing, and you need to be honest about that. And if you do truly want to do that, then we need to look again at our policy, because you're not going to do it. And if we're going to deliver 40% affordable housing, we are not going to house, under this government's policies at the moment, those 5,300 people on the register, because our officers have told you that this model doesn't allow for people in housing need to be accommodated because it can't afford what we're building.
Yes, well, I'm sure Councillor Ms James will be the first to recognise that under any government you're not going to house everyone in need. It's just because it's a never-ending thing. There's always people coming onto the list who need new homes. But
in relation to it, we're not.
So it's not really a political issue, is it?
No, it is a political issue. We are not going to be able to accommodate anybody. Very few. And if we wanted to scrutinise, and I'd love us to do it, the number of units that we built for shared ownership and how many we actually housed that lived and worked in the borough, I think the public would be very interested. I've tried to get it on the agenda and have failed, but I would like us to look at it, because we're building a housing for people that don't live and don't work in the borough.
Ms Brimcombe.
I was just going to put in a plea for our workshop on the 14th of February, because Councillor James is quite right that a lot of these issues have been raised before it. We've been doing a series of workshops. The workshop that's coming up on the 14th of February is all about housing need, and looking at not just because the figures given in 6.9 are just the historical need on the council register, but of course you have newly arising need, you have transfers, which is what Councillor Tilbury has mentioned. So we've done quite a lot, well, an awful lot of work over the last few weeks and months looking at need and who is actively in looking for housing and how you define housing need, and we'll be discussing that on the 14th of February. So if you've nothing better on that night, there'll be a lot of information there, and if not, we can get you the slides of that meeting.
I see you want to address this topic. I was just saying I'd very much like us to get onto BS 24, because that's why we're really here. These other points, well, I think I'm just going to turn it on to BS 24, and members, if they want to talk about housing need on that subject, then they can. But we're going to look at the first site, please, members. Councillor Watts.
I want to raise something on 611 and its relevance before we get to BS 121 in the table. But before I do that, I was wondering, Chairman, do you have any idea at all what the Labour Group's policy is for housing numbers in this borough? Because I've listened very intently for years and I haven't got a clue.
Don't tempt me, but I won't answer. Don't want us going down a political ping-pong match, Councillor Watts. It won't do them or us any good, because the public are here to listen to us discussing the sites.
I wouldn't dream of it. 611, we have the BS 121. The landowner has indicated only a part of the site is being promoted at this stage to accommodate 400 homes in the play period. We go on to say, whilst the County Council position is noted, it is not considered to be an overriding constraint to the allocation of this site at this point. Now this seems to me very strange. When we come to BS 121, we can talk about possibly whether that could be dealt with on a packet basis, and we can identify where the 400 might be. But in particular, of course, when we come to BS 098 before that, which is why I wanted to raise it now, there's the issue of to what extent we regard that landowner's opinion as an overriding constraint.
Councillor Watts, a point well made. Can we therefore park it for when we get on to BS 98, and you're perfectly entitled to raise it twice under that and 121. But can we move on to BS 24, please, which is Swing Swang Lane? Do members have any comments or questions to officers on that site? We're on page 63 of 172. Do you see? Have you found it? And we're just going to go down that list there, which is the BAS sites, ending up on SOL 002 Redlands. and we'll go through each of them. You can make comments. Bear in mind, as I've said to you before, the whole idea is to make recommendations or comments to the portfolio holder in relation to the sites. Councillor Miller, hopefully on BS 24.
Yes, Chair. I think I'm one of the more local councillors, ward councillors. It's next door to my ward, Swingsand Lane's in Old Basing. I don't know if anybody on the committee drives anywhere near Swingsand Lane. It's on the corner of the Danes Hill Industrial Estate. It's a field just the other side, sort of falls away down towards
The Hampshire Clinic and
yeah.
the south of the railway. It's on a slope.
Just to confirm that as soon as you drop down towards the Hampshire Clinic, you're in some very, very narrow roads. Those roads are used as a shortcut currently through Old Basing from the A30 to get into the Chinham, well, either to the Chinham shopping centre or to the A33. And I'm just going back to the usual thing about infrastructure. There's 100 houses going on there. Where are they? What's the transportation plan? Is it going to? It's logical that it would go out towards Blackdown. But if you throw 100 houses in there, again we're back to gridlock on those tiny lanes.
Is the transportation plan to take it back to the roundabout that's by the viaduct under bridge?
There's, in terms of the sites at this point in time, there's no specific plans that you can look at to see how individually the site would be dealt with, because that would be dealt with through a planning application and master planning. The work we'll be doing on transportation is to look at all of this cumulatively and see that there's no particular issues that a particular site couldn't be developed, so that by the time we get to pre-submission local plan, we'll have that information and it will be included in our site policies. Members might remember last time we had a site policy for each of the various sites, and that picked up the more specific points. Rather than referring back to the site policy for Swingswang Lane, which we had before, because we're doing this transport work, I'd like to sort of make sure that it's updated by the time we get to considering the consultation version of the plan.
Councillor Miller, questions or comment?
Comment. I was nervous in the last iteration of the previously shelved local plan. I think we're putting the cart before the horse here. We're being asked to say, yep, let's move ahead with this without knowing some of the essential details of how it's going to operate. There was a lot of members that I certainly spoke to of all sides, but forget the politics on this. This is matters of principle and policy. The members are being asked to make recommendations with not enough information. And I have to mention that with my background, I could never be able to support this model, if you like, in business, because it'd be thrown out, because the risk assessments just wouldn't work. How can we, as members, recommend some of these sites that we know where they're going to be? We know the Black Dam is about to undergo a very expensive reconfiguration, but it makes sense to bring these sites into events like the Black Dam roundabout regeneration. If you don't, and some of this infrastructure doesn't go in, the site doesn't work. Unless we have, as a principle in the council, that the P&I, which is a scrutiny committee, scrutinizes these sites as they go through various processes and has the option to say no, because it's not going to work, giving various timescales, then I think we're on a very, very dangerous path. We need to come to the satisfaction that what we're doing is right, and our residents see that it's right.
Hunter, yeah.
Just to say, obviously, that the site assessment deals with transport in its broadest sense. What we're saying is that we will be presenting to you by the time we come to you the next time round, that the sites will have been worked up in terms of the detail and the cumulative look at transport. This step in the process gives us the opportunity to have a set of sites to work within. These are the sites that perform the best in the site assessment work, and it gives us an opportunity now to work on a particular scenario. So today, for instance, we have 13 applications to undertake the transport work for us. So this will give us, these decisions will enable us to take that forward. What we're saying is that this point in time, we think these are the best sites, and looking at those cumulatively will enable us to come back to you in 2-3 months' time to say, yes, actually that all works and that's great and this is what we'll do, or actually one of those sites didn't work, or one of these particular elements doesn't work, and this is our solution to that. So I want you to be quite clear that this is a step along the process, and it's not a point at which you need to halt and say, well, we can't do anything until we know everything, because you're going to get that information before we go out with a public consultation later in the year.
As long as that statement by Mr. Hunter rests in the minutes, I'd be very happy, because there will be another stage in this process. I'll reserve my judgment.
Comments on that particular site. Councillor Harvey had my eye, then Councillor Shaw.
Thank you, Chair. The site lies adjacent to our ward near Norden in terms of Danes Hill. And in the context of the site, a couple of points I just want to make, really. In terms of it being in flood zone 1 with a 1 in 200 year occurrence of possibility of flooding, it also says in the site assessment that it should be part of a sequential test before the site is released. Now, again, we're into that debate again, aren't we? And this reflects on other sites as well. It's not just this one. I have yet to be confident, in all honesty, as a member, that that sequential test will stand up to scrutiny at EIP. And I'm not confident that, for example, in this site in particular, in its positioning and its relation to the industrial estate and the other land that other developers are seeking to promote in and around the Black Dam area, which we have all had correspondence on, is equally being tested in the same way. Consistency again in this one. So that's the first question mark, if you like, in my mind that I want to try and satisfy. I'm not sure we can do it this evening, but nonetheless I put it there for the officers. In relation to development itself, were this site to be developed, the two questions I have to ask myself are, is the site isolated where it is in terms of connectivity to amenity, to schools, to facilities and so on? And the question is yes, because of where it is in relation to the Danes Hill industrial estate and because of where it is in relation to access to other areas. So again, community cohesion, the logic of sequencing the site where it is, all need to be considered. Now, these are not arguments that are solely related to Swing Swang Lane. You know, there are general arguments that relate to other sites as well, and I appreciate that. But if we don't flag them up now, we're not going to. So I flag them up, and if it goes forward, it goes forward. But unless these issues are addressed, I think it's a difficult site to carry forward with consistency at EIP.
Just asking what was to the west of the site, and I'm being informed that it is the Hampshire Clinic. So this site adjoins the Hampshire Clinic, effectively. Mr. Hunter, in answer to those points, if you can.
Just in terms of the sequential test, obviously flood zone 1 is the best place to be because you're outside of flood risk, so make that point. The second point, just to say, is the sequential the sequential work that we've undertaken has been looked at by the EA, so they would be the biggest opponent, if you like, to the sequential the flood risk assessment that we've undertaken, and they've already signed up to the last version of it and informally to the new version of it. And in terms of isolation, I think that site is reasonably well related to a number of facilities, probably much more so than other sites.
Yeah, it was a question really following on from the officer response to Councillor Miller's question. Is there time? I'm thinking about a scenario in which the transport work that's been referred to throws up a problem either with this site or with other sites that are under discussion this evening. And is there time, and what would be the process if an overriding transport issue arose for other sites that would then need to be considered to undergo the same level of sort of transport testing as is in prospect for these sites that we're discussing this evening?
Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Chair. I think if the transport work that's proposed throws up any particular issues, we'd need to come back to this committee and report that. If there's a subsequent need to do further site assessment, then that would be the case.
Okay. Comments on this site, please. In which case, we'll move to the next site. Oh, yes, we're going to agree comments per site as we do them, okay? We'll just pause for comments before we go to that. Mrs. Brimacombe.
The one that I have recorded that would be minuted and passed on to the Cabinet was that before we go out to consultation, the committee would like the results of the this isn't perhaps the correct wording, but cumulative assessment of transport in order to inform their decision at that time, and you would like that to be passed to Cabinet. But in terms of the others, I was picking those up as questions more than issues or comments on the site.
Thank you. BAS 98, many down, parcels 1, 2 and 6. I'm hoping the officers will tell me that the diagram we have at the back of our papers has the correct reference to parcels 1, 2 and 6 on it. It does. So they are the most eastern parts. Oh, they're behind you. Behind you. Up there. Right. There. And there. Okay. Can I ask the officers a question before we start? Does this take account of the potential for any bypass, Western Relief Road, Major Trunk Road, any type of road that's going from north to south via the west?
Again, I mean, the site assessment is looking at the site from its constraints and positives perspective. We've tried to identify those parts of the site which perform best in that instance, but acknowledging that this is a much larger site and site that may come forward over a much longer term than the plan period, and hence we've identified components where the development might take place, but also where master planning should take place in its widest sense, which would then enable it to consider the particular points like secondary provision or a bypass route that links through the site. Obviously, this is of such a scale that it would take some time to build out, if you see what I mean. So the intention here is to identify the best bits that perform best and then identify the area that would need to be developed and looked at from a master planning perspective.
You raise that because it has been the view of this committee that whatever happens, the road has to be planned for first and the development then follows, and not the other way around. But I'm sure officers understood that and knew that and were doing that anyway. Isn't that right? Yes. I think that's a yes. Well, you're going to think about the road first and the planning, the houses, the layouts and everything else afterwards.
I think what we will be doing is doing a full master planning for the whole community, which would include all elements of infrastructure, including roads.
On roads, Councillor Miller. And then Councillor Watts.
I'm not stuck on roads. I'm talking about infrastructure in its widest sense. And that master planning should be done for the whole of Basingstoke, not just many down. And that's where we fall over, doing this site by site, piecemeal by piecemeal. I'm sorry, but I think this is the wrong approach. This is why I'm saying it early on in this discussion. And I'm looking over the whole borough here, because doing this piecemeal, and you made an excellent point, Chair, that think about the road first. But that's what we need to be thinking in all these cumulative sites that we're looking at tonight. And I'm sorry, I cannot agree with the approach the officers are taking.
Councillor Miller, would you like to briefly articulate what approach you think they should be taking, or at least the portfolio holder should be taking, please?
Some people will have heard this from me before, but you look at what we want to see Basingstoke like in 2030. You look at where the potential sites might be. What do we need in 2030 to satisfy those sites in all forms of infrastructure for essential services? We've had all the policies before. The community services, the transport services, the employment services. How much of it is employment land? Where do we see Basingstoke City in 2030? Bearing in mind we know the kind of cumulative development we've got to do. Then you start coming back and say, what do we need in place to make it work? That's master planning. They're quite professional, they know what to do, but you can't do it for a small bit of Basingstoke. Master planning goes down at various levels, but you start at a strategic level. The document, the SHLA, starts with this one word, strategic. That's what we should be doing. You wouldn't get away with this anywhere else in business. When they did the new towns, they developed a strategy, how we're going to build a town. They built the roads in Milton Keynes before they built the houses.
Mr. Hunter, reassure us, please.
Just to say that all the things that Councillor Miller has elicited and said there are all the things that I believe that we are doing. You'll remember last time when we went out with our core strategy, there's an infrastructure delivery plan that sits alongside the document. That sets out all of the infrastructure requirements that would be brought forward through the plan period. We sit underneath the vision, which is already adopted by the council in terms of how we take this forward. And the local plan is your strategic vision for sites. Particularly, all those large sites would need to be master planned, and we said that last time. All of the sites would have a master planning component to them. The transport work, for instance, is a cumulative look at all of those sites in the round to make sure that that all works from one component, from that particular component. We work with Hampshire in terms of education to make sure that the education is provided in the right places, and they ask us to secure land on sites to do that. We've undertaken employment land review, which starts to identify the best prime bits of employment land that we have and how we should protect those. We've undertaken retail study to enable us to be sure that the retail boundary that we're looking for in the town centre identifies the best of the centre so that we can expand where we need to and deliver what we need to. So everything that I think Councillor Miller said is all part of the planning process that we've already been through, and this part is particularly focused around the housing sites, and this is just one part of that jigsaw puzzle, if you like. And hopefully when you see the full plan and the infrastructure delivery plan, which we had last time, same process, will provide comfort to members that we're doing exactly what you ask.
Keith Watts, followed by Councillor Peake.
Thank you, Chairman. What we're discussing is BAS 098, and I've got 3 points I want to make on that. And the first is, incidentally, I've been impertinent enough to circulate another map that puts alphabetic identifiers on those that didn't have any identification. I used alpha just in case they already had numbers, but they were secret. And my case is that we've got to be considering the whole of this, and I'm unhappy about a report that sort of restrains that. But I don't want to criticise the officers. I think what they've been doing is excellent. I entirely agree that the proportion of general needs is a very important indicator as to the housing needs in an area. And they've been helpful to me since the first part of the meeting in trying to sort my ideas out. Unfortunately, I forgot to ask them what previously means. Now, BAS 098, why only parcels 1, 2 and 6? Now, I hadn't realised this still exists. I mean, it has been updated. BAS, well, the site assessments, BAS Manydown covers 819 hectares from pages 18 to 35 of that document, and still has in the words that it did in our last time round the track. On the first page, there are 3 areas which could potentially accommodate a higher level of development. These are to the west of the site, close to the northeast of Oakley. That's the first of them. So what's happened to that? I think, using my designation, that's somewhere around parcels A and B, or both of them. When I suggest that an area needs housing, you've got to realise I think houses are a good thing, and I believe in bottom-up planning, and if people need somewhere to live, then that's how we should define these things. We'll come on to Oakley, but I'll point out that Oakley is the 3rd largest settlement in the borough, but it's being recommended to have fewer new houses planned for than Overton or Whitchurch. So my first point of BS 098 is, why are we not following this indication that there's an area that could potentially accommodate higher level of development to the west of the site, close to the northeast of Oakley? My second point...
Should we deal with that?
Yes.
Mr. Hunter.
Let's do that.
Thank you, Chair. The section of the site assessment that Councillor Watts is referring to is in relation to the whole of the Manydown site. It's particularly under the landscape section. The commentary under the landscape section there refers back to the landscape capacity study, which was the piece of evidence base that provided the commentary for how you scored that site. So by just quoting that one aspect of the site assessment, you're only really just looking at landscape, and you're not considering the other considerations, access, biodiversity, and so on.
Well, could I ask, what are those other considerations that take that site out?
In terms of the site assessment, it's got a range of about 25 different criteria that form the site assessment work itself. And we've, as you'll be aware, we've looked at that site in its entirety in the site assessment work you've got in front of you there, and individually in the parcels 1 to 6 on the additional plan that's been circulated.
But I haven't seen any comments on the other 4 parcels.
These haven't been site assessed individually. We've just assessed them in terms of sites 1 to 7 as per the appendix which came out with the supplementary report. Which
Fatal why not question, Guy. Go on then. You might as well carry on, Mr. Lambert.
we feel that the areas 1 to 7, which generally abuts the periphery of Basingstoke town itself and the SPB there, it's because these areas relate most closely to the settlement of Basingstoke. They would be able to draw on the services and facilities of Basingstoke rather than being separate from the built form there. And they would be able to use the existing infrastructure that's there. If you were to look at areas A and B, you would be very much reliant on services in Oakley. You may also be narrowing any strategic gap that may be in that area that members are quite concerned about.
I'm sorry, there's a technique called the 5 whys, and I've nearly reached the 5th, haven't I? I don't think I've been given an explanation as to why there's been no assessment of the other 4 packets. And indeed, I'm not quite sure why we're using these particular packets. I suspect it may be something to do with the landowner, but I don't want to consider what they think.
Is that a comment or an attempt at a further question?
Well, I don't think I've had an answer as to why.
Right. Shall we ask
these
once more?
have not
Go on.
been-
In terms of site assessment, I think we talked to the committee about looking at particular parts of the site which performed well. We identified, as officers, those 7 parcels along the edge of Basingstoke, thinking that the Basingstoke edge is the more sustainable place to build, the more likely to key into key infrastructure, as Mark mentions. Those other sites were picked up in the broader site assessment of the whole site, but we've always considered the Basingstoke to be the focus for Manidown rather than Oakley as the key focus. If you were to take, for instance, Area A and develop that out on its own, it would be reliant on Oakley. It would essentially be an extension to Oakley. We've always seen Manidown in this particular incident, I can't say it properly, as an element for drawing and developing Basingstoke rather than the other way around. We've also been keen to make sure that there's no coalescence of those 2 settlements, and in doing so we've always focused our attentions along the Basingstoke edge.
So what? You warned us there was 3 and you've done 1. So number 2, please.
Well, the second one is why not parcel 7?
Parcel 7 came out particularly badly, I think, in the site assessment. So it's you try and identify what we've tried to do is identify those parcels around Manidown that have come out the best. So parcels 1, 2 and 6 are those that have come out the best from our site assessment work.
Brilliant. What's the next one? 5?
No, well, I did bring the site assessment matrices to the last meeting, but I thought I had the wrong document this time. I'll have a look at that on parcel 7. The third point is that somewhere in the document the phrase build rate applies, and there was some reference to the chief executive of the landowner having said something about that at the last meeting. I don't understand, and I really don't understand. I really do want this explained to me. I'm not trying to make any point whatsoever. Why should 400 houses being built on, say, BAS 121 be built any faster than 400 houses built on one of these parcels in Manidown? If they're separately let, separate contractors, separate developers and so on, I don't understand.
I think we've been through this before with the committee in terms of delivery of the site. As you see, we've identified two key component parts of the site, and we were always reticent to, I think in the Schlar, our original entry was about 2,500 over the plan period. And that basically is to enable the first parts of the plan period would be planning for this, master planning, achieving planning permissions, pre-commencing conditions, etc. We did some research in terms of looking at what sites of this kind of nature were delivering across the country in terms of numbers per year, to see whether we could do a higher number. And actually, the majority of sites were delivering at a much lower rate than 300 a year, which is what this would be, or just over 300 a year in the last 10 years of the plan. And that doesn't necessarily matter whether you've got lots of developers on site or not, is because basically you're serving a particular market. They won't build more than they can sell. So we're trying to give you a plan that is deliverable over the plan period. And what we don't want to do is go to an examination with 500 a year build rate, which is undeliverable, and then we're told at that examination to go back a step and find an additional site or three to make up the difference. So it's about being clear and sensible about what can be achieved in the timescale on that site.
I have to say I'm not really convinced by that. We're aiming at a build rate of 770 a year, as I understand it, and they'll be differently distributed in each year.
The question differently, Councillor Watts. If you want to put it. The officer's here to explain himself, and he will.
Well, the question is the one I originally asked, which is if 400 houses are being built in a particular period, why is it slower for them to be built on a part of Manydown than it is to be built on another site that might be in there? I haven't understood that, because by the time we get down to through the master plan letting contracts, there'll be separate sites.
As you'll realise, obviously certain parts of sites will follow on from others. You need infrastructure, you need roads, etc. And it goes in a phase. So you may well have different contracts and different letting, but those parts of the site will have to wait for others to deliver. I was involved in a site in Bracknell which was just under 2,000 houses, similar sort of size site, that delivered around 150 a year, primarily because each site waits on the next bit of infrastructure. What we're saying here is because you've got two elements of the site, we think that would help in terms of delivery. But to put all your eggs in one basket, I suppose, is the saying, and then you don't deliver, what does your strategy do? And what we're saying is that we think 300 a year on there in the last part of the plan period is an acceptable and achievable rate that we could convince an inspector of. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to follow on from the master planning aspect of things. With a site of 3,000 units in the plan period, but potentially a lot more, so we've got to look beyond that as well. Because we don't want to see in any of these sites, personally, I don't want to see any of these greenfields, and I'd like to see the housing numbers brought down so we can resist that as much as possible. But realistically, if something goes on one piece of land, there's a chance it's going to keep rolling on. And you've said that the master plan will be developed. Is it, or are we looking at these pockets of land, or Manydown as a whole? Because in terms of the infrastructure that is needed on a site of that size, we're talking about major roads, railways, the single bridge would need to be replaced. There is so much infrastructure that needs to go into that particular site. To just master plan for the pockets that have been identified. I'm not saying I want, I just feel like all of that needs to be in place first. Infrastructure always needs to be in place first on every site. But it's such a massive site, the potential to just develop a bit here and a bit there without thinking the whole thing through properly, we could end up with a complete sort of mess. So I'm wondering, are you looking at a master plan for that whole site?
Thank you, Chair. The map behind you shows that the orange hatched area would be the area within which master planning would take place, with a focus for development, i.e. the residential development and supporting infrastructure, to be within the orange red line. So what you may see in the orange hatched area outside the line is perhaps a road to serve the development, any necessary planting potentially a secondary school, that kind of thing. It's giving us greater freedom to ensure that the infrastructure can be provided to serve the residential development there.
Can I? Yeah, cheers. And so, in terms of sort of the water issue, and I'm obviously that's been looked at. I'm not convinced that there will be no damage or minimal impact on our water courses with any of these developments. I think, when the assessments have said that there will be minimal impact, and for example, I guess it's a bit like saying to a salesman, Thames Water here is going to have lots more customers, so is it in their interest to keep turning down these things, saying that we can handle it? They want to handle that because they want more customers. Reality is, already we can't handle it in this borough. We cannot handle the damage that's being made to our water courses. I think I'm correct in thinking that there's an aquifer pretty directly close to Manudown, and it was identified in here as a Zone 2 risk, which means within 400 days pollution could reach that borehole. I might be getting things a bit confused. I'm just sort of trying to think this one through. So that would mean there's a potential for our water course to be polluted by building out sites at this level. Is that correct?
These kind of things would need to be taken into account in bringing forward development on the site. So if you were to introduce any form of SUDs, the drainage systems, that would need to take into account the aquifer and the source protection zones beneath it. So they do crop up from time to time. They're not insurmountable, and they're fairly typical for planning applications to contend with.
And with the 400 days, when you look at that assessment, do you look at that alone and say, over 400 days, pollution will get into our water course? And what would be the impact over 10 years, 20 years? Does it, again, I've heard this word sequential, but is there a sequential assessment on water damage?
Perhaps we can come back to Councillor on that particular point after the meeting.
There's probably going to be more, but I'll let us.
We're here to make comments, as you know, to the portfolio holder. If you think a site shouldn't be included, you need to say, and if you think it just needs to be tweaked, you need to say. If you think the officers have missed something out in the assessment, you need to say, or if indeed you support the inclusion of a site, you need to say that. Although I don't usually think there's going to be that many people saying support that much development. Anyway, go on.
I'll let it roll for now.
All right, Councillor Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll probably say a little bit more about Oakley and some of Councillor Watts's comments when we come to the Oakley section. Perhaps just say at this time that I hope and trust that most of us, after our discussion on Thursday especially, are agreed that we should respect the integrity of our villages and not just allow them to be absorbed into the urban sprawl. And it also might just be worth mentioning, I'm sure this is one of the points that Mark was talking about, that actually strip that you've lettered is actually of a higher grade agricultural land than the rest, which obviously, as you know, our MPPF so well, has to be, that the lower grade has to be occupied first. Now, I just want to speak just on one thing, having established that Parcel 6 actually is part of the recommended sites. It wasn't quite clear to me from the overall conclusions page. First of all, everything I say, I am speaking for Oakley Parish Council as well, who are fully supportive of everything I say, so I'm not just speaking for myself. I spoke about the unsuitability of this Parcel 6 site at the relevant EPP meeting, at which we recommended Tibble's option D for land north of the railway line. So that says a lot about how much notice is taken of the recommendations of the Ofcoms. So here we are again, looking at this parcel below the railway line. I think we've always agreed when we're developing Manydown that we want some sort of coherence in what we do. We don't want to do it piecemeal, we want to do it properly, we want coherence, etc. So I look at this map of the suggested sites and I see this strange little spur, this triangular spur sticking out to the west. And I'm thinking this is a strangely isolated field to have thrown into the pot. It's stuck out on its own. It's sandwiched, and I know I've said this before, and I apologise, I'm boring myself saying this again, but I'm told I've got to keep saying it, otherwise nobody will hear me. It's sandwiched between a single carriageway road to the south, that's Pack Lane,
a double railway line to the north, and that small bit of Old Kempshot Lane to the east. So it's a very claustrophobic site. I'm not sure it would be a wonderful place to live, but that apart, the main point for me is that the westward route for everybody who lives on this plot of land would travel along the single carriageway road, which is Pack Lane, and the pinch point at the Battledown flyover, which is two tunnels that can only be passed through single file, and it already gets congested. I cannot see how this is going to work. It is totally inadequate. And it's worth mentioning too that as these cars going westward, and it is the only route west, there's no other route because of the railway line, as they pass on through, they go right through Oakley Village and then meet the B3400. So once again, I don't think that's really respecting our villages to churn so much traffic straight the way through them. So basically at this stage, I will reiterate what I said at EPP, what I've said at other stages of various other meetings. I don't think that this is going to work, and I would like to go back to the option that we actually recommended at the EPP meeting, which is that in this LDF we concentrate on north of the railway line, which we know is at least workable with some of the infrastructure that we've got. Thank you. Oh, actually, I could just mention too, just one more thing I've thought of. Since we are looking to the future to see if we can have a spur road that's going down the western side of the town, this little parcel of land on parcel 6 is surely the very bit of land that we would like such a road to pass over, where the railway lines are together and not where they separate later further west. So once we fill that with houses, that option will be gone. So my recommendation, and I would really strongly say this, is please can we not look south of the railway line at this time? Thank you.
Take 6 out, and 1, 2, and 4, and 5 is what you're suggesting. As the least worst option.
As definitely the least worst, not the ideal, but that is my point at this time, because I could say loads about everything, but that wouldn't be listened to because you can only make 1 or 2 points.
I appreciate other members might take a contrary view, just taking a little view. Do anyone want to speak on that? Yes, Councillor Harvey, Councillor Tilbury, and then Councillor Shaw, and then Councillor Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. It is worth remembering what the EPP committee sat and debated in quite some detail with Tibbolds sat round the table, who were clear in their very brief analysis because they hadn't gone into the detail that the map now needs to. And Councillor Taylor's spot on, it was 1, 2, 4 and 5. Admittedly bearing in mind where 3 is now in relation to it being separate and considered. And that's fair. And I think in terms of the other points, Chair, that relates also to Councillor Watts's point about delivery rates and the rest of it. Forgive me, but I don't agree with the officer's interpretation. And the 2 points I quickly want to make that relate to that is in coalescence. If we're talking about coalescence between this site and Oakley, that has not been taken into account in terms of Chinham and Bramley, nor Sherburn, St John and Popley. So we have inconsistencies in approach. I appreciate that, but at the moment...
Let's deal with the one thing at a time. But keep going.
Forgive me, but we're saying that now about this, and it's important to say it now about this in the context of this. We're also saying, in terms of delivery rates and the rest of it, that this would be parcelled up and it would be put forward at 300 units. None of the rest is being parcelled up. Not a single site to the north. All 6 sites that run off the north of Basingstoke are not being parcelled up. Therefore, all 6 of them can come forward at once at the build rates those developers choose to bring them forward with. So in some ways we're saying one thing in one hand on the land that we own because we own it, and may I remind us, Chair, that the High Court judgment said that all of the Manydown land, as Councillor Watts has rightly pointed out to us as in his email, must be considered carefully during this process. All of it. Not a bit of it, but all of it. And if we're not going to do that for the others in the context of an MDA to the north of Basingstoke, I think that raises serious questions. It really, really does about the consistency of this process. If you allow the developers privately to get away with doing it what they like to the north sequentially, in all 6 coming forward at whatever build rates, why are we putting one hand up our own back on Manydown?
Point. So 1, 2, 4, and 5. Take 6 out is your endorsement of Councillor Taylor. So well, can I just come to some of the other speakers, please? Thank you. Councillor Tilbury and then Councillor Shaw.
Sorry, could I just say it's 1, 2, and parts of 3 and 4. So I'm saying take out 6.
Not 5.
No, but that's not part of the recommendation, and I'm not adding that in.
Okay.
So it's 1, 2, and parts of 3 and 4 at the most.
Through you, Chair, may I ask, is that, you meaning Worting? As in the 3 being over Worting, is that?
Councillor, Mr. Taylor, we were looking at the same plan with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Are we? It's in the back of our papers. Make sure you're looking at the note. It's
I'm
attached to
looking
our
at
papers.
I'm looking at page 168 of 172, at which it's 1, 2, and parts of 3 and 4.
168 doesn't have numbers on.
No, it doesn't.
No,
It has.
can you look at the one
It has
right at the back?
suggested sites.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but in a sense, the parcels don't.
No, this one.
Don't.
This one.
Yeah, I understand that. They don't actually designate what parts of 3 and 4 actually are.
No, but are you looking at this? Can we all look at the same? No, that's not it, is it? Is it? I can't see from there. This is on the back of our papers, isn't it?
Yes, I'm looking at that one.
You
What
are.
I'm saying is that when officers say 1, 2, and parts of 3 and 4, this isn't the one that says what parts of 3 and 4 they're talking about. This is the one that says it. That one that's up there, basically.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. You understood that? I did.
I fully understand what you mean. I'm saying as up there, but not with parcel 6. Thank you.
Right. Oh,
Oh,
right on.
Go on then.
Got carried away with the buttons. Yeah, I mean, the officers made the point about delivering that Manydown can't deliver this now, and of course everyone's saying we should be able to deliver more houses on there. And I can't help thinking that part of the problem is we seem to be spending a lot of effort in making land available to builders who don't actually want to build on it, or want to build on it at a rate that suits them. So that isn't particularly helpful, you know. I mean, the whole point of building, making land available, is to give it to people who actually want to build on it. And there are plenty of people like self-builders, others, housing associations, so why are we doing it that way? So I think we could deliver more. The point Councillor Taylor's made is very valid. I mean, surely the argument for developing that, and it may be that the officers are arguing to put 6 in there because it's more deliverable, but I don't think it is. To build Old Kempshot Lane's caused enough problems for the Pack Lane Road, because not so much that way, they go that way all through Buckskin, but if you build on this side of Old Kempshot Lane, you're going to cause major problems. No one from the only way into Basingstoke from Oakley really is through that very narrow bridge. I mean, I drive that way if I come into town. You can go along the main road, but it's a totally isolated development within the Manydown area, so I think that's inappropriate. And perhaps if they're insisting on putting it in the plan, could they put it right at the end of the plan? But surely it would be more logical, as Councillor Taylor suggested, as you've got to access the other sites with some sort of bridge, tunnel, or whatever they come up with to get across that railway line. And of course at that point it is actually quite high, so it's a very high bridge or a very low tunnel, and which ends up with all the problems you get with the railway, where it floods all the time in the winter or gets blocked with people crashing into each other. So I think, you know, if they're going to put it in there, put it at the far end of the plan, or preferably develop some of the other sites first. But, you know, if the developers can't build at this rate, then there's something wrong with the developers. Because if you look at Basingstoke, look how many houses were built in Basingstoke in a 10-year period. It's far more than we're considering here. So it's possible to do this, but not the way we do it. Getting big builders to deliver sites is nonsense. They've got no interest in building housing for housing needs. They're only interested in building for their own, well, I think greed, but they've got their own agenda all the time. That's it. If you split the sites up, more people can build on it, make more available. The housing associations could build. They've got the money, but you know, all the time we're going to hand this over to, and obviously with the privately owned sites, we can't do much about that. But with Manydown, we own that. We can control the way that's built and delivered, so we can get a faster delivery, whether we want that or not. And I think Councillor Peach, and we've all made the point, we all think the housing numbers are wrong. That's the real problem. That's driving all of this here. We're driving a level of development in this area which isn't to suit the needs of Basingstoke or the borough as a whole, and that's the real issue here. But you know, all this is just going to coalesce and
What he was going to say.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. A couple of things. One thing, just as an observation on 3, it's really not clear from the level of detail that we have on the maps in front of us exactly what the part of 3 that is proposed for allocation is. The officer is going to Oh, right, okay. Right, okay. Well, that's helpful. Uh, that would be helpful if it's possible for the officer to show members that area specific. Yeah. Okay, the officers are now. Okay. Yeah, so that was helpful for everyone to sort of understand that. On this issue of sort of 6, I think 6, as it's proposed at the moment, is looking pretty dicey and vulnerable for a couple of reasons, really. One is the reference on page 116 of 172, where it says rather categorically development should be limited to the north on parcel 6. And for the understanding of members generally, what that bit of the report is saying is that the area that is shown hatched in orange beneath parcel 6 is, in the opinion of officers, unsuitable for development. Yeah, it says of that particular bit, development should be limited to the north of that strip. Exactly. Yeah. And that creates a bit of a hostage to fortune, I think, in terms of sort of, the inspector saying, well, you're saying the area south of that red line is unsuitable, and effectively you've got a sort of bit of sort of scrag end, if you like, that you're proposing for development, and it's somewhat difficult in terms of its deliverability and desirability and so on. So, so that is an argument, in favour of, 1, 2, 4, and I don't really understand. A line is being drawn about halfway across parcel 4, and what is being said is that the area to the east of that line, partway across 4, ought to be allocated. The area to the west of that should not be, and I've not really seen or had explained to me the rationale for drawing the line in that particular location. So, be useful to
Just
know.
answer the question of the rationale, or Mr. Lambert, as to why parcel 4 has been chopped in the proportion of 2/5, 3/5. Joanne, probably. Can you answer them, please?
Yes. In terms of why that line has been drawn, it's because to the west of that line there are a lot more constraints. The landscape changes at that point. The impact on Worting and the listed building conservation area around there differs at that point. There's also more biodiversity constraints from that point onwards, so that's really a break in the way that the land works on the ground.
This is the question on behalf of council. So are you saying it can't be developed or can't be developed yet?
It's not that it can't be developed, it just has more constraints than the area to the east.
Yeah, I think this is one of the difficulties with the approach, and I can appreciate the difficulty in terms of numbers, the plan period and so on. But I think we in some way need to join up our planning consideration of the Manidown land with the sort of consideration that is being undertaken by the landowner. Because the landowner, has made a statement of, what area of the Manidown land it thinks ought to be, it would wish to develop over a period of time, albeit outside the plan period, perhaps. The planning authority is sort of, responding to half of that, really, at this stage. I think there's sort of tremendous potential difficulty from that approach in terms of weakening the plan, basically, and the plan being open to criticism on the basis that, the landowner is saying such and such a thing, they're saying this area of land is developable, the planning authority is saying, well, only this is to be allocated. You know, I'm not getting a sort of sense of sort of understanding of sort of, you know, how the two are sort of matched with each other, and I think there's a risk of the two, you know, one or other undermining.
Then I'll see. We want to see move.
Obviously, what we've done is the site assessment, so we're putting forward to you the best bits, the sites that seem to have come out the best from the site assessment work. We've obviously been guided in a number of locations, not only to the Manidown site, by some of the submissions we've had from the landowner. And you'll notice that the area that we're suggesting for the wider master planning corresponds not exactly, but almost exactly with the submission of the landowner. So in terms of our closer working, we've probably done a lot more work in terms of constraints and particular issues of the sites. They are obviously looking at it from a more operational perspective, but I wouldn't want members to go away with the impression that we aren't having a dialogue with them and that we aren't responding to some of the information that they've been providing to us.
Councillor Gardner, specifically, we're just looking at what Councillor Taylor has suggested, that the proportion of 6 above Pack Lane comes out, and instead that it's 1 to about 40% of 4 and a whisker of 3 that remains in. That's what we're looking at, as see if that's a viable suggestion, either as a committee or in general terms, whether that's got support. So we're thrashing that around at the moment.
I hear what you're saying, Mr. Chairman, but I will broaden it slightly. Back in 1996, when we bought the land was bought for the purpose of being able to develop the Manidown estate in its entirety. What we were trying to avoid was piecemeal development of the site in the absence of the infrastructure, in the absence of a master plan for the whole site. Now, what Andrew Hunter has proposed, to me, makes perfect sense. I'm quite happy with the numbers being proposed at this stage, because I think to widen it further without the master plan would be very dangerous and would be totally contrary to the purpose of buying the land in the first place. In terms of Parcel 6, I agree totally with everything that Councillor Taylor has said, and it should not be included. We should concentrate to the area to the north of the railway line.
Please, sorry, the mathematical calculation of taking that portion of 6 out would be what?
That's in sort of in the region of about 500 homes.
Over what period?
Over the plan period, I mean, that's
Yeah.
500. So at the moment, we're talking about, sorry, it's nearer 750. Sorry, I was reading something wrong. So it's about 750. So you've got to find something to replace that.
It's the way it works. Something comes out, something's got to go in. And it's all very well thinking about taking things out. If we're going to get further into that mode, we ought to be bearing in mind of putting things in. Or we just leave it as a strong comment coming from certain people and allow the portfolio holder to make the ultimate decision. All right? Well, I can't hear you, Councillor Watts, sorry. Well, that is exactly right. But of course, the members of the public are hoping that we will shape things as well as him. Councillor Gard.
Thank you. As Councillor Tilbury and I suggested at last week's meeting, this is the opportunity to look at the SPBs in the villages with the possibility of putting in around 750 extra homes over the 15-year plan period, which would certainly soak up the missing 500.
Councillor Harvey. Do you want to speak on this particular council? And then we'll go back to more general terms about the whole site.
First of all, I'd certainly support the comments made by Councillor Mr. Taylor. What I'm a little concerned about is a remark that the officers made about one of the reasons why they're choosing these particular sites, almost along the Roman Road area. because of the existing infrastructure and facilities. Existing infrastructure and facilities anywhere in Basingstoke are stretched. I sincerely hope that they really meant that they would provide the adequate infrastructure for those particular sites alongside Roman Road. It's nice that it abuts Basingstoke, but Basingstoke doesn't have the required infrastructure and facilities. That's the first point. The piecemeal bits and pieces, I agree with Councillor Gardner. It's got to be done in context. So my specific question is, because I don't believe we have a comment in the document about parcel 7. It's not, you've only included, is my understanding, in this document about the ones that the officers are recommending to go forward, but not the ones that they haven't. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct, although there's a full summary of the conclusions of the site assessment for every site in the appendix. What number is it? Sorry. And that particular one is page 117. So every site, every category 1 site was site assessed, and what we're saying are these are the best ones, and the site assessment conclusions are in the appendix. And I think page 117 deals with parcel 7.
Without reading it, I'll take that as it's been answered, but it strikes me that category 1 sites, it's the easier ones. I'm just very conscious of that remark of existing infrastructure and facilities that was made on the presentation.
BS 98. Any further comments? Councillor James, then Councillor Peter.
Chair, it's just in relation to the comment you made regarding Councillor Taylor's comment that she would like to see that site removed, and that left a shortfall of 500 units. And you're saying, if, as a committee, or as if Councillor Taylor would like to make that as a comment or a recommendation, we then have to, or are required as a committee to find another 500. Can I just...
No, I'll explain. What I mean is there's consequences. We may not find them and we may not be able to solve it, but there are consequences of us taking something out, a site out, and we just need to bear that in mind.
But
I don't mean that we necessarily have to go and pick
No.
them ourselves. So
I do understand what you're saying, but what I want to just remind us of the recommendations of the report, and it makes comment to Cabinet on the recommended preferred distribution, and it goes on. I mean, it's not for us, and there has always been an issue, and I think Councillor Cubic has always raised this, that in relation to what we have here as a menu of sites, that all of it, and she's always said this, would have to be used because we haven't got enough to choose from. But that, in a sense, isn't the issue. We're here tonight to talk about site selection, and if a councillor feels that a site isn't suitable, it isn't then for this committee to say, you know, there may be a consequence to that, but I still think it's important that if Councillor, I'm not saying I agree with her, but if Councillor Taylor feels that it's appropriate that that site is removed, she needs to make that comment to the Cabinet member. It's not then for us then to identify a site tonight. That's another issue for another night.
Thank you. It was just to follow on just ever so quick point as well about that we might have to find other sites to infill if there was a decision to remove any particular site. Well, that might not be the case if we get our, in my opinion, housing numbers right and brought them down a bit lower. Then we might not be in that situation in the first place. Looking at this site, when I was reading through the site assessments and everything else that's gone with it, it just seems to have every single imaginable thing thrown into it, whether it's water or heritage sites or infrastructure needs. Everything seems to be there as an obstacle, and that's and it's the same as every site across the borough. I mean, we are in a difficult situation when we're having to deal with these things, and there's obviously parts of the site that are more difficult to manage. And if we're talking about mitigating, perhaps I don't think it's possible, but perhaps we can mitigate against the water resources. But when we're talking about removing important heritage assets, and rare flora and fauna, and these sorts of things are being removed. How do you replace them? Because when they're gone, they're gone. I mean, one of the things that attracted me to Basingstoke was the fact that you can live in a really nice town with countryside right on your doorstep, and I just think it's such a terrible shame that in every aspect we're looking at, it's removing greenfield land. And on top of it, you know, and this is why I'm going to have to say it again, in all of these, it's so important that we get that house number right, because if you build more people will keep on coming.
Just two quick points, Chair. I think the portfolio holder is going to have to weigh what we said this evening, but also what was said at the EPP meeting in relation to the vote that was taken there, the decision that committee made on the parcels. I mean, it isn't just us. I mean, there are other committees, but you're the decision taker, so we respect that.
I'm instructed to say to you that it's this committee that he listens to.
In which case, we should record that another committee did come to review and had a very full
You
debate.
have pointed that out.
And that's very fair. There were other members than us just sat around the table debating this issue. And the other point to bear in mind is the relationship to the High Court judgment. We can't escape that. The whole site must be assessed. Whether you agree that it's in or out, how you choose to approach it, this process has to fulfil that judgment. So the quality of that and the quality of the assessment of all needs to be carefully thought through.
Mrs. Brimacombe to sum up the comments on BS 98.
The first one wasn't a specific to BAS 098, but I think there was general consensus around the table that master planning needs to be carried out for the whole borough, not a piecemeal approach starting at a strategic level. I think the whole committee was nodding at that.
No.
Yes? Am
Yes.
I getting yeses?
Yes, you are.
Or not?
You are.
You want to recommend to the Cabinet that the option of 1, 2 and parts of 3 and 4 be considered but not 6?
Or putting it the other way around, we have very strong concerns over 6 and its viability. Whichever way you
No,
want to put
the
it.
whole committee's not agreeing with that.
Point out that I was arguing for more of the site to be properly assessed, not less.
Similar to Councillor Watts, it's a rather sort of subtle point in a way, but part of the point I'm making is that, you know, looking at that map behind you, Chair, those areas that are, you know, indicated by the landowner, but not for allocation, you know, need a considered, you know, planning approach to them. Because that's an area of sort of potential conflict and you know, debate as part of the examination in public. So I think you know, certainly what I'm arguing for is a great deal of care about and comprehensiveness about, you know, those sites, you know, 1, 2, 4, 5 and 6. And it might be that, you know, the net result of that is sort of that one goes down the line of 1, 2, you know, a little bit more of 4, you know, some of 5 maybe, you know. So it's more subtle than saying, you know, 6 out, 1, 2 and 4 in.
If you know, if you're applying some logic, the big issue with 6 is that the roads are very poor. It's a track virtually. It's not a proper road. If you were going to build more in that area, surely it would make more sense to build on the B3 400. Now the fact that that's already overcrowded is going to cause problems for that, because that's only a B road. But the point is that, you know, without getting the roads right, none of these sites are particularly clever, are they? But that's probably a worse one than some of the other ones. It seems crazy.
That was my original question. It's not so much a constraining what is in. It's grave concern over 6. That's where our agreement fixes on 6, but it may be much more fluid on the other parts. Councillor Watts.
Could I point out that the northwest corner of Oakley, which was referred to in the passage I read out, is north of the railway? The northeast corner of Oakley, the west part of this site.
The only other thing was that several mentioned several members mentioned was the delivery rate and whether you wanted to make a statement to the Cabinet about reconsidering that or not. That was mentioned by several people. I didn't know if there was consensus.
Councillor Gardner.
And my comment was that delivery rate indicated by officers was satisfactory.
That's all I thought.
Thank you. Right, the next site is BAS 104, land north of Popley Fields. Can I remind members of what I said to them on Thursday? There are two things we need to consider. Firstly, some members of this committee may have sat and determined a particular planning application in relation to this site. Can I remind members, of course it remains a matter for them because we all believe in freedom of speech, but if they should comment on that particular application, their answers and comments will be listened to and could form part of a planning appeal should it be that their comments were, as it were, such that might undermine the reasons they gave in the first place for refusing that application. So can I remind members the best thing to do is to confine your comments to the suitability of the site as judged against the site assessment criteria. Likewise, can I remind members of the other point, which is should members show some implacable hostility to the site per se, which of course they're perfectly entitled to have, but should they show it, then we could be open to challenge that for some reason we're not fairly considering the sites because we blocked one of them out. Does that sound familiar to members? So therefore I would urge members to approach this with an open mind but judge it against the site assessment criteria. I hope that advice is clear. And now comments or questions on site BAS 104. I see that Mr. Davis is in the audience. He was one of the speakers that addressed us, and of course his concern was coming from Sherborne St John, in particular about the coalescence as well as the sustainability of the site and a number of other issues which are here. But perhaps can I ask a question, unless any anyone wanting to kick off first of all? Is this site totally dependent upon its links to Popley? And how is it viewed as being linked to Popley? That's my first question, please.
I'm not quite sure I know what you're getting at.
Would its access and links to Basingstoke be connected through the existing housing development within Popley?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, because it's on the edge of Popley, it would use some of the infrastructure that is there to connect it into the Basingstoke area.
Second question is, what in terms of the site itself, what is envisaged to protect the residents of Sherborne St John and surrounding Sherborne St John from the adverse impacts of having that development there?
Thank you, Chair. And excuse me, I understand its buffer planting would be provided as part of the planning application to bring forward that site.
Be within the site?
Would be within the site.
And so what sort of distance? What sort of range of buffer planting? Are we talking about 100 metres deep?
Probably couldn't comment on that level of detail, but just thinking about the quashed plan that we had last year, that was very clear in allocating this site that buffer planting would be provided. And if we were to take this site forward in this plan, again, we'd have a similar policy wording to make sure that that's in place.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I mean, we're talking about buffer planting. One of the obvious issues that the residents of Sherborne St John see Basingstoke approaching, and one of the arguments I've had sort of when we discussed sort of Chinham's with planning officers in the past, said, well, why is Chinham treated this way? I said, well, it's part of Basingstoke. Well, I said it's got a parish council. It doesn't matter. It's part of Basingstoke. It touches Basingstoke, and that's the problem. It's like a game of tag, but the difference is when you get caught, you're not out, you're in. In this case, you'll be part of Basingstoke. If we're going to put buffer plant, that suggests that's an end to it. So surely we should be looking at putting some sort of green belt around Sherborne St John, and if they want some development there, they can have it on that sort of basis. They're protected from Basingstoke when they're contributing to the housing numbers, instead of seeing Basingstoke approach towards them. And I believe in the NPPF, I've meant to copy it out, but it actually talks in there about, you know, we as a council can set up green buffers and do that to protect the countryside, because that was part of what it was supposed to do. But unfortunately, it seems to be abused, for want of a better description, to just generate more and more development all the time. And we talk about sustainable development, but it's not sustainable to just totally destroy the countryside. That to me is just illogical. It's just you know. I had this argument when we went to the cabinet when we were talking about the housing numbers overall, and I was told, well, Basingstoke's got to keep growing. What, indefinitely, forever and ever, until it runs into London? There just seems to be no end to this. We need a strategic plan to say at what point is Basingstoke big enough, and I think the residents of Sherburn St John, probably Dummer, certainly Oakley, think it's far too big already, and Bramley are obviously see themselves about to be tagged, so they certainly don't want any more. So we need to look at this. We're not looking, how can we find more houses to meet the needs of developers who don't want to build houses and can't deliver them? I mean, this is just quite bizarre. And at the end of the day, if there was that much demand for it, we wouldn't have I mean, they said we haven't got a 5-year housing land supply. I don't know what we have got, probably about 2-3 years. Are they rushing out to build them at the moment? Of course not. And they never do they? It's, you know, we need to look at this strategically. We keep coming back to this. We're supposed to be doing this to produce a local plan, but it's just a local plan to create more housing sites and gradually spread Basingstoke until it covers the entire borough, by which time Reading will have reached us from the other direction, and London will probably have caught up with the other side. I mean, it's just, you know, and Winchester spreading up the M3 this way. There's just no end to this. We've got to get to the point that we keep talking about sustainability, and for sustainability you need stability, and that means you need a reasonably stable population, and we don't seem to be getting anywhere close to that. We're trying to encourage more business to come to this area, while at the same time there's mass unemployment in the north. It's just, the whole thing's just crazy. But you know, that's what we need with this sort of site. If that's going to be a buffer, then surely by implication we're suggesting that's the end of Basingstoke for there, because there's no point building a buffer and then 3 years time building the other side of the buffer, is there? So I think I've drifted off a bit there.
Councillor Tilbury. Councillor Harvey, then Councillor Peach, please. Sorry, Councillor Harvey and then Councillor Miller, then Councillor Peach.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of things to say up front on this one before I say anything, Chair, if I can. Firstly, I attended the Development Control Committee meeting that heard both applications, and I spoke as a visiting councillor at those meetings. I did not take part round the table as a voting member of those committees. I spoke as a visiting councillor. And I raised the direct issue of prematurity, followed by a series of concerns that I will reiterate now that relate to the site. And my specific issue during the DC meetings was obviously the prematurity of the applications that were brought forward in the context of this very process. Secondly, I found myself in an interesting position of declaring previously an indirect pecuniary interest. Having consulted the lawyers, I don't have that. I have a job that relies as a consultant self-employed, receiving commissions of work from a company that happened to be working for David Wilson Homes. Now, I find myself in a position of speaking directly against this site in that context, so speaking against that very issue. But I want to say that openly up front. That's been declared on my register of interests, and I will continue to say it till the cows come home. Forgive me for the preliminaries, Councillor Miller, but it's important that I say that for the public record. I really do. In terms of this site, then, landscape analysis raises fairly serious issues in terms of the landscape reflections from Sherburn St John back to Basingstoke, but also in relationship to other sites surrounding Chinham, and that's a very important point. The landscape study and the landscape analysis that has been done is something we need to pay attention to. The agricultural value of the land in the context of it being still used as agricultural land in relationship to the farms, in relationship to the north of Basingstoke, is something else we should bear in mind. It is not solely related just to this site, because we can make it in relation to others, but this is the first one that's come up, so I'll say it here. In relation to the coalescence issue, I do think that's important. In some assessment we say there is a desire not to have coalescence, therefore that's a reason for not doing it. And then we say this creates a physical barrier. The words get contradicted throughout, so we do need some consistency there. And coalescence is a very important issue, and that was raised during both of the planning applications in relation to this site. Wildlife and biodiversity. We do have some wildlife issues here, as raised by the Hampshire Wildlife Trust. Very clear about protected species that are on this site, that have been moved to this site from other sites that have now been developed. So again, there are important issues to consider in how many times do you move an endangered species until it doesn't need moving anymore. Things to think about. Highways and access. The a site assessment makes some important points in relation to how this site is accessible, and I think this is one of the ones that really does stand up to scrutiny. The accessibility of the site through the existing road network would see you looking at existing accesses being created as part of the Merton Rise and Marnell Park developments, which aren't wide enough to take a scale of development proposed here in their current form. They wouldn't be wide enough to take a context of traffic as buses or emergency vehicles or so on. That came out during the actual planning applications, and that was a serious issue. There is a physical constraint because those have been built. Those roads are built. They exist there now. They happen the fact they just stop dead end going into a field is something else entirely. The other issue in terms of access relates to Jersey and Guernsey Close, because in the context of trying to get a site access here, you would need to come off of an already very congested internal estate road. Now that creates an issue, I think, in terms of safety and accessibility as different to what is written in the site assessment. And finally, I guess that the main point to make is that this is the only site at the moment to have been democratically tested by our development control processes. There are others in the pipeline. Now, in that context, we have had a DC committee sit and listen to a developer actually bring forward proposals for this site, at which the scrutiny of those applications resulted in 2 rejections unanimously around the table. That must send a signal to us as a council in how we consider this site. If the DC process has done that already, then that is something that bears relevance, because that's a democratic process that we've entered into and we are at appeal. All of those things are relevant to consider as material considerations for the consideration of this site, particularly in relation to the appeal that exists. And it is relevant because you can't mess the two. The developer will choose to use our words as they choose to, regardless of what we say. So we've got to be careful, and I'm trying to pick them carefully, but it is relevant to our consideration at this and I would actually propose that the site is withdrawn for those reasons.
Yes, of course, members will note this is be the first site that is going around the east of Sherburn St John, as opposed to everything else being to the south, which is a sign of unfortunate things to come if it is allowed. Let's hear from other members. Councillor Miller, please.
First of all, I'm the Vice Chair of DC, so I was sitting next to the Chairman during the deliberations on this particular site, but I'm not going to refer to the DC. I'm going to refer to the words in the document here under the site assessment conclusions. I'm commenting from personal knowledge of, and I'm going to get them wrong, the Marnell Park and that site, the existing sites. Access has been mentioned, and yes, any access to the north of Popley Field site, I'm sure we can come up with some better descriptions of these sites, is going to be very difficult. It states in here, development of the site would relate well to the recent developments in Popley and would not result in physical coalescence. I challenge that. I challenge it very strongly, because if you look on the maps where the borderline for the BAS 104 would start is right next door to Marnell Park. I'm sorry, but what is the definition of physical connection or physical coalescence? Because it's a matter of 10 yards, 25 yards, whatever it is. It's right up next door. It's acknowledged that it will be connected. We've heard that tonight. I don't understand the words in the assessment, and I challenge them, because it is right next. It's dependent upon the existing site in Popley. The only other thing I really want to mention. Yeah. The other thing is about the buffer planting. I've got a couple of friends in Sherburn St John, apart from the ward councillor, and I happen to know that from Sherburn St John, if you look back over the fields towards Marnell Park, and you want to put another 450 houses between Sherburn St John and Marnell Park, no amount of buffering is going to hide that particular development for probably 50 years because of the topography of the land. That's the problem. Topography is everything here. We're imagining this is all a flat plain. It isn't. We have undulations all around, and everything has to be accounted for. And I'm sorry, buffer planting isn't going to work.
My initial point was to echo the coalescence issue. I mean, I just can't see how the site can work as it is. It's blatantly going to be connected, isn't it? But also, I was following on from Councillor Tilbury, and I think he touched on something that I've been sort of mumbling away to myself for a while, which is about what is the capacity of Basingstoke? How much can we handle? I'm pretty sure there was something in the water studies that might have mentioned around 19,000 more homes, perhaps. I might be wrong, at the point where their water courses fall into complete mayhem and they're beyond repair. So I'd be interested to see if there could be a capacity study on Basingstoke. I mean, what is our upper limit? Because we can't keep building and building and building, and if it can't cope, there's fundamental issues, sewage, water, I know there's infrastructure, of course, but if you haven't got water to drink, then we're absolutely stuffed. So I'd put that to it as well.
Officers want to comment on that?
Just to say, in terms of the capacity, lots of the work that we've already done in our evidence base, so the water cycle study, employment land review, all of those types of things, start to look at those sorts of capacity issues. And Ashlar is another example of the capacity of land available for development. So all of those things are looked at as part of processing the plan and putting it together. Just in terms of the coalescence point, I think the point that this is making, and perhaps isn't quite clear enough, is it's talking about the coalescence with Sherborne St John rather than with Popley. It's talking about physically close to Popley, but it's the coalescence with Sherborne St John which is not an issue. I think that's what that's trying to say.
Councillor Miller, do you want to comment on that, since you raised it?
Read the words. It says Popley. Hence the comment. Page... okay.
On what you're saying, I'm just saying that development on the site would relate well to the recent developments at Popley and would not result in physical coalescence. And what I was saying was I think that should be attributed to Sherborne St John, not to the Popley point.
I think the officers accepted the ambiguity which you've picked up on. Right, Councillor Miss James, please.
Thank you. I also want to say that I, as a visiting councillor, came to speak against the application, so I just want that on record. But I also would like to second Councillor Harvey's recommendation to have this site removed. I think it's, as has been said by Councillor Miller, I think this is really interesting to actually see a sustainable assessment in the conclusions of it against what we know. And we're not able to do that on any of the other sites, but because I know this so well from the planning application, it is useful to look at it and what is written. And I think it's really challengeable as to what this site assessment conclusions. It's very concerning. The issues have been considered through the assessment of both the landscape and biodiversity constraints and have been acknowledged. It goes on. One of the things that I really am concerned about is a development on the site would relate well to the recent developments at Popley. I mean, I'd quite like to ask, I have several questions. That's the first one. Why would it relate well to? That's my first question.
Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Chair. It's essentially because it's adjacent to Popley, it's able to make use of the facilities and services that are available there. It's as simple as that.
Can I ask, as part of that site assessment conclusion, what facilities, what would it relate well to? Could you, because that was a real concern as a principle of development, not the detail of the development, but the principle was that it didn't. So in your assessment, why did you say that this site related well?
Mr. Lambert.
Well, it's the physical access in addition to the availability of services such as the primary school, the John Hunt's school, the local parade that's within walking distance of the site.
James, carry on.
I think it's already been raised about what you said about the physical coalescence. I think that's an issue in this report and it's very concerning. the site links to existing areas and has some local accessibility, positive assessment. What does that
Again, that would be physical access, so it might be footways, cycleways, roads, access to services. All of those things would enable you to do a good accessibility on foot or not necessarily by car, so you could use those facilities that are already in the existing area.
Again, I go back to the principle of development where that was challenged and it wasn't upheld. I mean, it wasn't in relation to this assessment. I would like us at a later stage to take this site assessment conclusion, and as a committee, when this is over, I would like us to scrutinise this against a planning application, because I think this would be a real test for us to look back on our officers' work against a site. And we're not able to do it on any other at the moment because but we're in this position now where we could do that. So I think we should do a piece of scrutiny, even though we have a subgroup set up to look at this and scrutinise this. And I think it's important that we do this. And if you remember, Chair, one of the things that I said to you, is more about the detail of the application with this, is around when I said to you that we should scrutinise this against our officers talking about landscape and about open space, where they objected to the detail of an application, and it was important to look at against our open space policy, and we didn't do it. But again, I really think it's a piece of work that we should be doing, because
I understand what you're saying. Of course, whether you want to raise that at the end of all these discussions, you're free to do so again at that stage, because obviously I want to progress with these sites, and then you can come back to that. Dangers, of course, are we get tangled up with a specific application, which of course is potentially still live. Who knows where it's going at the moment, and I certainly don't want this committee getting tangled up in that. And also at the same time, there is the danger that we are questioning the officers' professional expertise, which is what they're there to give. We may not necessarily agree with it, and frequently at DC people don't, and I don't as well. But the fact is that's what they give. It's their expertise, so I would respectfully ask you just to go back onto the site and veer off that suggestion for a moment, please.
before I do, can I just say it isn't about the site, it's about policy, and it's about open space. And I just gave that to you as an example, and I can give you 10 others here.
Did you understand what I said?
I did.
Thank you.
The other thing I want to raise here is about, as part of this assessment, it talks about financial contributions would be sought to refurbish and expand facilities. Could I ask the officers what they mean by that? And none of these elements are seen as an overriding constraint. What does that mean as part of your assessment?
Thank you, Chair. I don't have the detail in front of me of which exact facilities would be expanded, but it would be in general to look at what facilities are there locally, whether that's community halls, school provision, and to consider whether there's a need for additional facilities to accommodate the additional population that will arise. And so we would seek contributions from the developer to secure that.
Chair, I don't think that's good enough. I'm asking, in relation to a site assessment, what financial contributions will be sought to refurbish and expand? If I have to consider this site or make comment, I would expect an officer to be able to tell me what is required for us to actually achieve that development on that site. And I'd like to know.
Mr. Hunter's going to give you an answer. Councillor James.
I think I mentioned these earlier, and just referring back to the previous core strategy, we have a site policy in there, and that starts to identify the particular things that you would be seeking through the development. So, for instance, it might include measures to mitigate the impact of development on the local road network, including improvements and access arrangements at Carpenter's Down and the A340. That's an example of what was in the last plan, and gives you the types of things that we were looking for. For instance, there will also be things like the expansion of the local primary school. and there's a cost there for about 1.5 million to do that. So those sorts of things would be the things that would be in the policy, and then they would be elaborated further through the planning process, so that you would then hope to secure those through planning applications.
question I have is in relation to developing the site for housing is unlikely to lead to any overriding negative effects, although some impacts were identified. And it goes on. Could you just tell us about what those impacts were?
I think the conclusions that are set out in the site assessment try to give you a balance of what the good and the bad parts of the site are, so they're all set out in Appendix 3.
What concerns me is that in terms of the sustainability objectives to protect and enhance a distinct, it goes on to talk about that. But what my concerns is, we lay out what the concerns are, but then we say, but we recognise that there are real concerns around flora and fauna and to protect and enhance. But then we also go on to say, but it's only in parts of the site. What do we mean in parts of the site?
In specific locations on the site, there may be particular constraints. So in one corner, for instance, you might have flora and fauna issue. In another corner, you might have, great crested newts, for instance. We're talking about a particular site. So the site assessment is more detailed than, it looks at the site in the whole. And what we're trying to do is draw out, as we have done through the SHLA, through here, that none of these sites have got, none of them are the golden ticket. They've all got issues, and they've all got those things that need to be overcome. And what we're trying to say here, these are the ones within the framework, that the best ones that we can take forward.
And I think that's my point, is that none of the sites that we're looking at tonight have a green ticket, but everything can be overcome. Anything can be overcome. And my concern is that every green field within this borough is vulnerable as a result. And because we've looked at this site, many of us on this committee tonight have looked at this site in some detail, against this site assessment, I think it really concerns me that I just feel very uncomfortable with this site going forward, with this site assessment. I don't think this is a fair assessment, and I feel that would like to second the recommendation to have this site removed.
We've got that, and thank you for those comments. Of course, I think in the words of George Orwell, some sites are more vulnerable than others. Now, Councillor Mr. Taylor, please. You wanted to comment on this site, and then we'll see if we've reached the end of the comments on this site, and we'll get Mr. Brimacombe, who's had a very firm messages from all around so far. So.
It's just an observation, really, and drawing us back to what we were talking about late on Thursday evening. I would certainly not want to be hypocritical and say I don't want to protect Sherborne St John every bit as much as the other villages that are actually separate from the town. And there's a pincer movement going on here, isn't there? Looking at the size of Sherborne St John, it's just a suggestion, but one way that we could protect a village like that that's so close to the town is to perhaps slightly extend its SPB so that the village itself can expand and take a hit, rather than getting the town to creep closer to the village. It's like the Oakley solution, isn't it? And in a sense, you kind of earn your right to the strategic gap if you've taken a little bit of a hit. And I notice on Councillor Tilbury's very helpful statistics that he forwarded to us that the population of Sherborne St John has actually gone down by over 200 over the last half century. And it's just a suggestion, though, that maybe it's not exactly a trade-off. That might be a better solution for maintaining that gap, is to allow perhaps a bit of northwards and westwards extension to the Sherborne St John boundaries in order to maintain its integrity as a village.
So, Mr. Taylor, of course, the points you make are very clear, but of course that doesn't actually address that site, which is what the task we have is. The task we have is judging that site by the assessment criteria and what we've looked at. But we all appreciate the point you're making. Councillor Harvey, on that site, please.
Just very quickly, I appreciate what Councillor Taylor is saying. It's interesting to note that the current extent of the Basingstoke North Action Plan, which was the two existing regeneration areas that have been done, and the greenfield that was built out of Marnell and Merton, take you to the ridgeline. The one thing that this allocation does is take you past the ridgeline and out into the open countryside north of Basingstoke. Were we to take, and I really do appreciate the point, but there are other fields that are under land ownership that were this to go forward, I would be concerned by default would be coming forward during a planning process. Now I know that's separate and I appreciate the office is going to tell me off for even saying it, but personally that northern sweep is important. It's not just this site, but it's the county-owned West Lane Farm. It's all those other sites that relate to the coalescence of Sherburn St John. So I'm looking at this as well from the point of view of, is it a field too far past the ridgeline north as a matter of principle in that context?
Right. The approach I've taken is try to identify anything where it was mentioned by more than one person. I think there were at least two people said that there was a recommendation that this site should not be a preferred site for development.
I think we might get more than that if we were to ask. I don't think there's anyone suggesting it should be. Well, we won't have a vote, but does anyone think it should be left in?
Do you want that recorded, or as
Broadly, the rest of you would like it taken out? No.
Make a qualified response. If someone will tell me where else those houses are to be built, because I've been suggesting that more should be built on Manydown, and that didn't seem very popular.
Is not in Basingstoke and Dean, but I don't think we can deal with that. If they need to be built at all. Well, look, is there a broad feeling that a grave concern about this site being kept in the process? So, silence or a yes? Yes? Okay, there you are.
So we'll pass that on as a recommendation. Then in terms of specifics that would go under that, the reasons for that were raised by more than one people, there was an issue around the buffering, and the no amount of buffering will allow this, will hide this site for a significant number of years, but there were more than one person mentioned buffering, yes. Landscape analysis was flagged up, that flagged up a number of significant concerns, yes. Landscape. Coalescence is a significant issue, particularly as the site is dependent on the site in Popley, and access. Transport concerns around the access, particularly as it has to come off existing congested roads, estate roads. Those were the ones where it seemed to be mentioned by more than one person.
Councillor Watts. Gary Watts.
One of the speakers the other night, I think it was Sue Davis, said that this area has had over 2,500 homes in the near vicinity, and they're not against development, but not right now.
Yeah.
And I think we should record that as part on this site assessment. Thank you.
Want me to add that to the list? Yep.
Suzanne Deness is the person. Next site is BAS 107 Razors Farm, and members will see that to some extent it is connected to BAS 122. What I should do is allow members to consider whether they want to comment on both sites separately or together, because there is a probably same concerns. The residents have objected to both of those sites. And can the officers confirm for me, just so we got them correct, firstly, these sites, are they to the west of the railway line going to Reading, and to the north of the business park, the Chinham Business Park, where there is no adjoining direct other residential accommodation currently? And How far to the north of the BAS 122 is Bramley? Because it looks to me as though it's very, very close. But the map is chopped off. Well, just to the right of it seem to be all the train tracks from the army camp.
Yes.
Or something, whatever it was there. Unexploded bits, or still is. Just so we have our bearings, because then we can pick up on the points.
The northern area of the map is in the parish of Bramley.
Yeah. On my map, it's got train tracks here, or something like tracks.
Yeah, that's the camp.
That's the army, Bramley camp, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Yes. Okay. And is that undevelopable because of what goes on there?
Yeah, pretty well.
Yes. Councillor Miller, you can answer, but I was going to ask the officers the questions, but you can answer if you wish.
I've been over every square yard of that facility for different reasons. One of the biggest ones, I know they've had various investigations, it was a storage of mustard gas during World War One and other very highly toxic materials right up into the mid-50s. It has also been used for, well, it's not used for live firing now, but it's got a lot of nasties in it. It's used 363 days a year by the Ministry of Defence and the security services.
Really is a finger pointing north. Right. Comments, please. Councillor Shaw, let's start with you.
It was a question for the officers, actually, because at least one of the members of the public raised the issue of the risk of this site constraining widening of the A33, and I wondered if officers had a response on that. Yeah, I've been corrected that that's in relation to 121, so we'll come to that later then.
Councillor Tilbury?
One of the issues that was raised by the councillors in that area is that obviously it was sort of start to join Bramley and Chinham together, but also it's next to the business park, and it obviously is likely to impact on one of the major employers there. And we had this with the Lemon Lamb one, where at the last minute Sainsbury's suddenly realised, because no one had bothered to tell them about it, or certainly not head office, that building a large housing estate next to their 24-hour distribution depot might have a bit of an impact on their business plans, because the point is once you build a house, those people are legally entitled to complain about the noise and all those issues as if it had just been built, despite the fact that I think the company's Air Products, which are operate 24 hours, they could end up being constrained by a housing development that was built next to an industrial. And that's the other issue again with these things. Surely, we generally when these were planned, you tend to try and keep some separation between in very industrial sites, as opposed to maybe an office business park, which can be a lot quieter. Any industrial site, you tend to have lorries and just noisy. Any sort of metal bashing type stuff can cause all sorts of problems there. So I think that's a major issue. But and the access to it, you'll potentially have the access to a housing site through a large industrial park, which just seems quite strange. That's one of the minor technicalities with this, to say the least, isn't it? And it is just very and if you look at the shape of this as well, Basingstoke's starting to look very strange, isn't it? It's just like a rather large, strange sort of blob, isn't it, going all over the place and pointing off in different directions wherever there's a field available. Again, it comes back to this issue of strategic planning. I mean, we're gradually sort of strategically seem to be planning to head up the A33 to join up with Reading. I remember as one councillor had this plan to join Reading in Basingstoke. I think he called it the city in the trees or something like that, but fortunately he's no longer with us.
I didn't raise this under Kiln Farm, but I want to raise it under this site and go back to Kiln Farm as well. It's the quality of the agricultural land. If I remember, this is where the tenant farmer came to speak to us and talked about the quality. Was that Cufford? Well, we'll talk about well, okay, I'll talk about cuff.
You combined the both, Chair, didn't you?
Yeah.
122. It's 122.
122.
James, you're perfect. Sorry, I know you've been corrected by others who, I respect their opinion, but you're right. Carry on. I'm happy for you to deal with both at once because they're both in the same area and both linked.
Okay, so in relation to Cuffle Farm, I thought that on the night she made an amazing contribution, and I think that it's an issue that we're not, and it worries me in relation to the site assessments, that the quality of agricultural land and what we are actually losing, and that includes Kiln Farm, where it's being farmed, and that quality, we need to make more, and I think we need to look at our assessments and where we're actually losing this land, and that concerns me. The other thing, and you're not going to like this, Chair, but I'd also like to make a political point about another member of the public that came along to speak, and that was Councillor Elaine Still. She came to speak on Razor's Farm and speak against it. But I'd like to remind the committee, but also the members of the public that are here, is that Elaine is a member of the Cabinet, and on the 23rd of January, she agreed the draft core strategy, which included Razor's Farm as a proposed site for development. She didn't speak against Razor's Farm at that meeting, and she didn't vote against it in the draft core strategy. So I'd just like to remind the members of the public of what she did, and I also like to remember the members of this Cabinet. And also she's on the executive of the Manydown executive, and should she really have been along and spoken as an executive member?
I'm sure the webcast will be played back to her if there's anything relevant in it. Well, do we need to? I don't want to deal with Mrs. Still, to be honest.
It's not Mrs. Still.
Right, go on then. Mr. Lamb.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to confirm that for sites 107 and 122, the agricultural land is classified as 3B, which is classified as moderate. High grade is 1, 2, 3A.
So, officers, a question at this point. Can we deal with the sustainability of this location? I don't like the word sustainable because it seems to me that it means all things to all people whenever it's needed. But this is clearly, we've been told, down a very narrow country lane, quite close to some very old either estates or country houses, I've been told, and I've been listening to what the members of the public have been saying, and it's bounded by an industrial estate and a railway line. How do the officers justify it being sustainable?
The issues that you've raised are constraints with those sites, and they are acknowledged in the site assessment. But as we said before, they're balanced up against other constraints, and it's our view that those sites come out more favourably than some of the others.
First, a question to you, Chair. Yeah, I know we're combining two sites here, 107, 122. 107 has, there's a outline planning application has arrived in the borough. There have been considerable communications from local residents, both in Bramley, Chinham, and Sheffield and Loddon. A lot of the information that we now have gathered supersedes a lot of the information in this site assessment. Now, I can look at this site assessment, but I have to take it in the knowledge of a lot more information that's coming. And this site assessment does not reflect what we now know on some very important sustainable, come back to you with sustainable, which I heartily agree with you, all things to all men. But Councillor Tilbury's already raised it. There is on Razor's Farm, right adjacent to the planned site of 107, a company that bought land 25 years ago, specifically in the middle of nowhere. In other words, right at the edge of the Hampshire International Business Park, which is completely adjacent to the Chinham Business Park. It's the northeast corner of it. Air Products, that, as Councillor Tilbury said, operates 24 hours a day, is very noisy with compressed oxygen cylinders, I believe they also deal with nitrogen oxygen mixes and everything else. So there would be no hindrance to any habitation, to dwellings. And we don't want to end up with a tail wagging the dog here. And this has got to be considered right up front. Because I looked in the noise section on page, in this document, I never know which document we're looking at in these site assessments, 114, in the sustainability assessment of the site. And the only noise they put down is because of the railway track and a slight reference to the business park. I'm no expert in this particular aspect of noise, but I'm quite sure the health and safety executive would have an assessment to make on the particular Air Products site. Air Products have submitted an objection to the outline planning application that's about an inch thick. And I'm not going to reiterate what they put in there at this meeting. The other issue is the business park itself.
Do you want to comment at all? Just only to say that the Air Products particular point is picked up in the site assessment, and we've had a view from environmental health on that. But probably looking at it from the perspective of a resident, in terms of the impact it would have on a new resident as opposed to the impact on the business, as you point out. So that's a slightly different thing, and that's our site assessment wasn't set up in order to look at it in that way. But I take your point.
From the business park perspective, at least 2 ward councillors have met with the managing director of the organisation, MEPC, who run the Chinham Business Park. And without significant mitigation of the access to what I think it's the Crockford roundabout, we know it as the Red Man roundabout, ring-fenced funds and an improvement to that roundabout first, that's a condition from the business park perspective that if this site went ahead, and I'm paraphrasing a letter that was sent to the council on an objection from him, if that didn't take place, he is aware of at least 4 of the businesses within the business park would move out of Basingstoke. Because they have a traffic situation today inside the business park, which is currently 80% occupied. He will probably be 95% occupied by 2013. That is insufferable because of that roundabout. As people leave, they go, by the way, they bomb burst out of the Chinham Business Park and they come through Chinham. And this is why I'm speaking, because Chinham carries the biggest impact here. There's other impacts in the existing Taylor's Farm, and I dread to think what Bramley and the north of Crawford Lane would suffer. Because once crowd ace break through across Crawford Lane into Taylor's Farm, and should this other development in Razor's Farm be built, then, well, I dread to think what's going to happen. But when we start to impact employment, which again I refer back to this document on the conclusions, when they say I'm assuming here the words mean the site would largely have a neutral impact on economic objectives. This would be negative. And if we're going about this site assessment, I think at this stage, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Let's go back to what we said before, strategy. We've got to start looking at this right up front. Now we're going to have to handle it through a planning application. It's too late. I won't go on about the transport side. I think it's self-evident that this again is part of the cumulative effect. You can carry this on with 122. They're right adjacent to each other. Don't use the word coalescence again, please. But it's coming down to essential services. I see there's references in here about medical facilities. As a ward councillor, I am in direct contact with the Chinham Medical Centre and the Dental Centre because that's the only medical centres, medical facilities we've got. Okay, there's a private dental side, but talking about the general population. Our medical centre goes bust in 2014, they can take no more. There's a critical mass that occurs in terms of the medical profession. It's not Hampshire County Council, it's the PCT. I won't go into the details, but it's a very difficult situation for the general medical practice. They have to expand. There is nowhere to expand. They've expanded 3 times. And by natural growth and their catchment area, they've got nowhere else to go. So these are strategic services that you do not build a place without addressing. I'm not going to go on too much. I've got so many circles. You've heard a lot mentioned on Taylor's Farm by the public speaking last time, but I've tried to identify 2 of the very potential showstoppers that have to be addressed. And as I say, this will probably be progressed through the outline planning application that's upcoming in the next few months. Sorry to have taken so much of the time, Chair.
On 107 and 122, you can do it individually or together. Councillor Harvey, please.
Thank you, Chair. Follow that. So just in terms of the actual site assessment, I mean, some of the specifics here. The section on the top of page, where are we? 99, where we talk about important habitats or negative impact on the characteristics and sensitivities of the landscape being a direct loss. I mean, what do? Keep moving them out the site as the housing gets built? I mean, either it is a loss, therefore it is a constraint, and it can't be mitigated, or it can be mitigated, in which case the site shouldn't have been allocated in the context. It's the sense of, you can't just, once the habitat is destroyed, it's destroyed. End of story. So there's some interesting phraseology here. Maybe I'm reading it wrong, but I'm reading it the way I'm reading it. In terms of the relationship to Basingstoke and the relationship to Bramley, the whole rest of that paragraph just stands out for me. It would not lead to the coalescence due to the extent of countryside between Basingstoke and Bramley. This is building on the countryside between Basingstoke and Bramley. It's the very thing it says it's not, and that's the bit I find difficult, because you can't have 107, I can't have 122, sorry, without 107. The office is admitting the site assessment, I think quite understandably, that the isolation of 122 cannot be solved without implementing 107. The problem with all of them is the context of their isolation from other development and their isolation in a layout proposal that could come forward. And it rests the whole success of the allocation on an acceptable layout coming forward. And I would challenge a developer, actually, any developer, to genuinely come out with a layout assessment or a layout proposal that could give you the kind of security that the site assessment is looking for. And so I've got problems with that in terms of what I think would happen at a planning stage. Just to put one aside, if you don't mind for a second, Chair, the context of us having yet another site in the list that's coming forward as a planning app, do these developers ever get the message? This is the democratic process, not them trying to ram raid DC. This infuriates me. It feels as if, as well in the context of some of this, as if we're chasing our tails. The business park issues are critical. I think the air product concerns being raised now in the context of this site assessment hold material weight for this site in allocation. And I would really flag that up. If we are saying that we are happy to build next to our business parks in this context, in our local plan, I have a concern for other sites and the principle and the precedent that then sets. So if we're going to do this, I've got worries. If we do it, it's going to open a can of worms in terms of lots of other sites around the town and in some of the other rural areas as well, with sites that it just begs the question to be asked, really. And finally, in terms of taking it forward as the last paragraph, the last bit here, talking about the constraints around flooding and around transport linkages and so on, I have not seen anywhere in any of the documents any of those elements being satisfactorily addressed in a strategic way across the whole of that Chinham area, running up from Crockford Lane right the way up to the rest, whether it goes north or south, or through the country lanes, which I imagine a lot of it would do. I just don't see the assessment giving me the confidence that we should be allocating these sites at all at this stage. And I would go as far as to suggest, my worry is, why is the list being constructed in the way that it has, Chair? Because either the developers are leading the nose here because they're putting in planning applications and we're responding to that, or we are doing a genuinely objective assessment that actually a lot of these sites, why in the world are they on the list in the first place? It's that sort of, who's wagging who here, and I know that's not relevant to the process, but it's a genuine question, I think, as we can hear, that residents are asking, and we've got to answer that.
Just to make it clear to members, obviously the site assessment is our professional view. We're trying to put to you what we think are the best sites. But just in terms of that particular site, I think you'll all remember last time when we discussed this, that was one of the sites that was in all options. And I don't remember any discussion on that particular site at that time. And that was taken forward in the plan because of its reasonably, Razors Farm particularly, because it was a reasonably easy site to develop and take forward. So we're certainly not being led by developers and planning applications. We're taking forward the site assessment as we did last time in an objective and assessed way and presenting to you what we think are the most sensible, acceptable sites, notwithstanding that all of them have some issues to overcome and some constraints.
How are we doing on these two? Any more comments on these two sites? Right, can I ask Mrs. Brimcombe to sum up our comments, please, for the portfolio holder?
I think the comments that were particularly picked up there by more than one person were around the impact on the industrial areas. First of all, there was the from a noise perspective, that it might be limiting businesses being able to expand because that would create noise which would impact on housing further down the line. And secondly, the other aspect I think was around access and how it would, without significant road improvements, it could actually limit the ability for economic development in the borough in those particular industrial areas. And you have specific examples where businesses may move out.
Chair,
Councillor Miller?
It was the use of the word development, economic development. It would be a negative impact on the economy. We're not looking to expand it. There was also an address, if you want to talk about development, one of the points made during the public speaking was historically, and I can't quote how long, that site was always considered to be the expansion site for the Chinham Business Park. That was one of the essential parts about it.
Would members like it to be kept as the site for expansion of Business Park if necessary?
Yes.
Well, there you are. Yes, Mr. Hunter.
Just to say, obviously, we've already done evidence on employment land, and we've done on employment land supply, which suggests that we don't need to allocate any further land for employment development. There's ample within the borough, within the various employment areas. So that goes contrary to the evidence that we've already presented to members.
I think I can read some members' minds that if we get to a year such as 2025, where is the sites going to be then for further employment land? And when we get to 2030, surely they should be, there's one way of saying is we're planning for that eventuality, that expansion.
Obviously, the evidence base that we presented does look to that period because it's covering the planned period. And obviously, most of our focus and attention is on the prime Basing View, for instance, in terms of where we're trying to direct development, but also sustaining those sites that we've already got so that the vacant sites, the vacant plots and the vacant buildings can be reused.
Mrs. Brimcombe's made her comments. Councillor James, on the comments, okay?
I want to be clear that, because I don't know that she captured everything, and it's picking up what Andrew said, is about sustaining our existing sites. And so I want to be clear that a view of many members here is that housing development will impact on that existing employment land, and I personally have grave concerns about access onto that employment land and off of, and what that will mean in relation to those existing employers, and if we lose those from the town, what impact that will have on us as a borough.
Right, members, as you will see from the Basingstoke sites that remain for us to... You will do standing orders. I'm just coming on to that. That's all right, Mr. Mason. They're effectively come in two pairs, because we could look at Kennel Farm and Basingstoke Golf Course either parallel or consecutive to each other. and also then there's east of Basingstoke and Redlands site, which again we can look at concurrently or consecutively. What I'm going to suggest to members is as follows. Firstly, we extend standing orders, and I'll give you the suggestion of the time. We suspend the standing order that prohibits our meeting until 9:30, and as part of that, I would suggest to members that we constrain our discussions to the Basingstoke sites and say to the members of the public that outside of, I'm just trying to find, there's a master list here. Outside of those on the list, we're not going to get to Overton, Whitchurch, Bramley, Kingsclear, Oakley tonight, as far as we can tell, if those items look like they might be contentious. And I would have thought that various people wanted to have a little bit of a discussion about Bramley. I would have thought that Councillor Watts will want to say something about Whitchurch. Wouldn't that be right? Oh. And Overton, Councillor Trilby, were you likely to say much on Overton? Yes. Well, would it be in the mood of the meeting if I was to postpone those other items and sites from those other areas till Monday the 31st? Or would you be urging me to say, let's see how we go? All right, and we're trying to see how we're... Yes, so Mrs. Brimkin wants to say something, but I'm just about to extend the meeting, but we'll come...
I simply wanted to point out, in case any of the members of the public are going to go back or to go home, that clearly if the next part of the meeting is the 31st of January, this won't be going to Cabinet on the 29th of January. What we were looking for today was a day to have a special Cabinet meeting in the event that you had to run over tonight. I can't give you the exact date of that. We had some problems with logistics and finding rooms and things like that, but it will be very likely to be early February, and we'll put it on our website as soon as we get it, right in the front page, and we'll email everyone that we've got contacts for. But if you don't get an email from us, please check the website.
Right, so, and if you come to listen to the non-Basingstoke sites, thank you for the communication. I'm sorry to disappoint you. You won't be hearing from us tonight about those. So if you wanted to leave, now's the time to go. If you want to stay, that's fine. Members, what I propose we should do is we should start with perhaps one of the largest of those. Well, in fact, if you look at them, actually, it's not the largest necessarily, because Basingstoke Golf Course is pretty big. Let's going to start with the BAS 121 east of Basingstoke, and allow members, if they wish, to talk about SOL 2 Redlands, if they want to in the same bite, or if they want to do that consecutively, we can do it consecutively too. So members, and are members agreeable that we'll try our best to finish the Basingstoke sites tonight, and we'll end when we've done that? You're happy for standing orders to be suspended to allow that to happen? And if we get to some time around 10:15, I'll pause and just see how we're going. But let's see if we can stop nearest 10. Right, members, comments or questions on BS 121 or SOL 2 Redlands, and you can see it on the big plan here, there and there. Councillor Shaw to begin with, then Councillor Watts.
Yeah, it was my earlier question, Chair, about the A33 and constraints on widening the A33.
More than just that, can we go before that to the paragraph 6.11, which I think was Councillor Watts raised? What is happening with Hampshire County Council, please? And why has the officers have the officers said what they've said? That's hopefully put very neutrally.
Since we've discussed the SLA with members, we've received communication from Hampshire County Council that they were looking to only put forward part of the BAS 121 site during the plan period. So they were looking at 400 in this part of the plan period, and then the following plan period, so 2029 onwards, the remaining 500 or whatever it would be. In doing that, we wanted to be very clear, because they're a public body, like we are in terms of the Manidown judgment, that we weren't making any mistakes as we made last time in terms of the Manidown land. So we wanted to conclude with Hampshire what their reasons for removing the part of the site from discussion, if you like, from this part of the plan period. There were two things that we looked at. Firstly, what they held the land for, and our understanding from our communications with them is that they hold the land for the purposes of development. And the Manidown judgment was clear that public bodies needed to act upon what they own the land for. It was also clear that we as local planning authorities should undertake an assessment of land to see whether it's suitable, achievable, developable. And in doing that, we asked the County Council a number of questions in terms of what the constraints and the reason they're holding back the land. And at this point in time, the reason they're holding back the land is from an operational perspective. They want to release different parts of land at different phases. To our mind, that's not a planning impediment. We have to assess it from whether it could come forward and whether it's got a planning objective and we could take it forward. And in doing that, we've come to the conclusion that there's no overriding constraint that they're telling us that they can't, the site couldn't be delivered against. And as such, we've said that we think in the plan period it is perfectly acceptable and achievable to see 900 delivered on that particular site.
Mr. Hunter, can I just press you for the interpretation of the operational approach to Hampshire County Council to this piece of land, because I think members will want to know whether it's something that's fixed in stone or whether it's just the flip of a coin of a particular officer or member on a particular day. What is it, please?
All we know is that it's for operational purposes. The report which dealt with this is in confidence, so we've never seen the report. We've only simply had the conclusions, the consultation, the information provided to us from the officers there. It was a formal decision of a cabinet member, but their only reason for not taking it forward is that they've got a number of sites around Basingstoke which they seek to take forward, and they want to do that in an operational way, so that they can release land at particular different points for, so that they get receipts over a period of time.
Question: have they determined which part of the site they want to push forward first?
In the information they've given us, it's the top end of the site, so it would be the site abutting the Seoul site. So, yeah, that triangle there and up to the Seoul site, so that the access could be achieved from the into the site.
Someone else now. Yes, Councillor James, far away.
In relation to the map, can you tell me the bit that they want to develop now, is that near Park, is it called Park Pale? Where does that can you show me where that is on the map? I just say as well then, if I'm speaking now, is to remind this committee that back in September 2011, our recommendation to the cabinet member was that this site be removed, and the reasons that we gave then, that the cabinet consider removing site B121 given concerns about Park Pal, western side of the boundary is a conservation area, impact on the water cycle and the flood zone, and there's real concern about runoff, and given the nature of the topography, and it goes on. But we had a recommendation, and we all voted on that and supported that. I don't know what the outcome of that recommendation. Obviously, the cabinet didn't listen, but it would be nice to know, the comments of that. It was very clear as to why and what our concerns were at that time. And it would be nice, and it was a different cabinet member at the time, Rob Golding, but again, did they hear our concerns?
Just to say, members will probably remember that there was a supplementary report that went to Cabinet covering all of the comments that were made by this committee with an officer comment, and then it was for the Cabinet and the Cabinet member at that time to consider all those comments and take that decision forward.
The reasons why you're saying what you're saying, but I think you need to reiterate your comments now, if you've got them to make, that is, to benefit.
Okay, so if I can just reiterate those again then, the concerns about the link to Park Pale, and if you look in the report as to what it says about Park Pale, I don't need to then talk about that site as to why that isn't appropriate for development. I mean, there's real concerns within the assessment that's been taken place. The western side of the boundary and is a conservation area. Impact on the water cycle and the flood zone. There is a real concern about the runoff, given the nature of the topography. This will exacerbate flooding on existing dwellings, and that was a real concern about Park Vale, Pale. Noise issues associated with the site. Land study states concerns that about the site. Impacts cannot be mitigated, such as Hetty's Brook and SS1, and the grave issues that need to be taken into account. Many experts deem that the site is not suitable. That's what we said last time, and I'd like to just put that on record again.
To the next speaker again, and I know those comments have been recorded. I've been reminded that I get my Thursdays and Mondays muddled up again. The next meeting will be on Thursday the 31st of January and not on Monday the 31st of January, but I can assure members that I do know today is a Monday and not a Thursday. Right, next person, Councillor Shaw. Councillor Watts.
Yes, Chairman, I try not to talk too often. When somebody asked how come Razors Farm and Cufford Farm are on the list, well, of course, in the long run, looking back, when the committee voted for them to be called in the SLA, a decision was made that they should be approved as sites. And I remember that I opposed Razors Farm and Cufford Farm and this site, which I think is known as Pirates Hill, being accredited as suitable for development anyway, so I feel in a sense bound by history to go ahead with that. But I also feel bound, since I believe that the housing target is right, well, it's the best we're going to achieve, that it's an obligation on anyone who's proposing one of the sites should be deleted to propose an alternative. Now, I've made quite clear what my alternative is, and that's to exploit the land at Manydown as much as possible. And I don't regard exploit as being a negative thing to do, which would give Manydown the benefit of all these people living there. But in this case, I think that we had a pretty clear idea when we were considering it in the SLA. And I haven't been back through all the detail, all the consultation comments or so, which I did all read at that time, that this isn't a good place to develop. And now I'm glad that it's been explained what's going on with the County Council. What we should do, surely, in that case, is not approve this site BS 1-1, but consider approving the site the county are now proposing. Because we're being told to basically overlook what the county are saying now, list it for 900 houses, and I have a sneaking feeling that if we do that, there'll be 900 houses there before 2027. But if...
I'll interrupt you for a second, then I'll let you carry on after. This slightly reminds me of a little pickle that certain members of the council got themselves into about whether land is available or not. Because it sounds to me as the whole site is available because of the way it was purchased, even if it's not necessarily being promoted.
Well, yes, I think it is an exact parallel. And Manydown is still such a case, and yet we're taking the landowner of Manydown's view on which packets should be taken forward, but not the landowner at Pirates Hill. So I would support the removal of this, but everybody here knows that I'm backing that up by saying that the space for the same number of houses should be found on Manydown. I also think we're in a very...
Councillor Watts, I'll let you come back, because Mr Hunter wants to comment on that, and then you can come back, because just in case, because you want to get it correct, what you're saying, okay?
Just to comment in terms of the landowner side at Manydown, I think we've been very clear as a planning authority that we've looked at specific parcels of land. The landowner has done its own work, and we say we concur in terms of the area that should be looked at in terms of greater master planning, but we've been very specific about the parts of the site which we think are the most developable and most deliverable. So it hasn't been led by the landowner, that's certainly been a planning assessment.
Give you the entree back, actually.
Well, in which
to
case,
explain that, you see.
Well, in which case, can we have the same assessment of the parts of BAS 121 that are more developable and others. Don't let's go ahead with 900 in our list, pretending that it's all right for our 5-year plan, but accepting that it's probably going to be built on in the long run. Let's be honest about what we're doing. If we're not going to take it out, let's leave in.
Why are we putting, or you as officers suggesting, that the whole of the site can go in when the landowner's only promoting half of it, or a third of it, or a quarter of it?
I probably didn't explain it clearly enough. I'll come back to the money down. We need to do a planning assessment to see whether there's an overriding impediment why it couldn't come forward in the plan period, and that very much sits with the local planning authority to do that. If, for instance, the landowner had come back and said, we've discovered an ancient monument on the site in a particular area that can't be overcome, and we can't do a particular, we simply can't release that part of the site, that would be one matter. But this is just from an operational perspective, so they're not saying it couldn't be developed. My understanding from their officers is it's purchased for development purposes, and as such, taking that forward, we've made the assessment that 900 could be achieved in the plan period.
Councillor Shaw, who wants to talk about widening the A33. How wide do you want it to be?
Wide enough, I think, Chair. It was really the question that asked being residents about whether development on this site constrained the A33, and also be helpful to get officers' feedback on the issues that residents raised about sequential tests as far as flooding is concerned, because residents argued that this was the site that had the highest risk in terms of flooding of those that had been proposed for allocation. So our officers satisfied that they are not on sticky ground in terms of the sequential test.
Sorry, Mr. Hunt.
I think I'm going to try the transport one. In terms of the A33, obviously, depending on what you do with the site, where you develop up to, what you agree in terms of transport improvements may have an impact on what you do with the A33. I can't say specifically what that might be, but you would investigate that through the master planning. In terms of flood risk, I think Mark's going to...
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, as members will be aware, the site contains flood zones 2 and 3, which is the area around Petersbrook and Whitmarsh Lane. This is flagged up in the sequential flood risk assessment that we've undertaken. That's set out in Appendix 4, which lists sites in order of preference, effectively flooding-wise. There's both the SLA and the previous policy and the core strategy made clear that any allocation on this site would not feature built development within flood zones 2 and 3. It was very clear that we would avoid, development in those locations. So, from a flood risk point of view, we feel we've considered that point. It's been addressed in the flood risk assessment, and that's been signed off by the EA.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, the obvious sort of thing with this site, apart from the sort of flooding and all those sorts of issues there, is the presence of the sewage works and the incinerator, which doesn't exactly sound like a sort of environment anyone's going to want to live in, are they? But I mean, how much has this been considered? Because one of my colleagues availed me of the maps that were produced at the time when they built the incinerator, which show the concentrations, and it's all going to land on the people who live in this area there, so it seems a bit it's almost like they've been used as a buffer zone for the rest of it, isn't it? But it just seems rather, surely there's got to be a decent sized buffer zone for sort of facilities like this, because not only is the incinerator pretty unattractive, it's got a rather large chimney in the middle of nowhere, but the whole, you don't want to be anywhere near particularly a large sewage farm. The one in Overton's smelly enough in the summer. I can't imagine what this is like, and given the size of it, this is a major sewage works. This isn't, one for a small hamlet. It's not a cesspit, is it? It's a rather large facility. So, what is considered to be a reasonable distance that you should be building close to a facility like this? Because I'd have thought it's at least a mile.
I have to say, when I drive into Bournemouth quite regularly, down the spur road into Bournemouth, you really have to hold your breath for about. But it isn't actually a mile, but it's a few hundred metres.
Thank you, Chair. This is flagged up in the site assessment work as an issue that needs to be considered in bringing forward development on the site. That the policy that had allocated the plan in the previous Quash plan made specific reference to ensuring that acceptable noise and odour standards could be met within the homes through suitable mitigation works, and we would expect the landowner to submit details to us so that we can consider that as part of the planning application at a later stage.
I think Mark mentioned noise, but I think noise is probably the least of the issues there, isn't it?
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick point on back to that one. It's not the developers or the landowner's responsibility to sort that problem out. Most of the developers have got issues where they do build next to sewage works, as it's Southern Water or Thames Water or whoever it is, it's responsibility to sort it out, and it causes no end of trouble. For me, I think just looking at this whole debate we've had so far, what is it that actually constitutes the site? Who draws up what a site is? Now, if we've got a landowner that's gone through a process here, we've been told by officers, I understand this, that they say that it was bought for development. Now, I'd like to see that in writing, because I've got an issue with...
An answer to that, Mr. Hunter? You waved the piece of paper.
I'm going to try to read it out, and then it would be helpful. I don't have the report. I just have a response from the officers, but it's just to say. Just say. Yeah.
Much better, I'm sure. All will agree, including members of the public. Get it out in the open, whatever it is, so that we can hear it, and so whatever the answers are. So there can be no more mysteries.
Sorry, I should have highlighted this bit.
Or different mysteries.
Here we are. As you know, purchased by the County Council some years ago to enable the comprehensive planning and development of Lichpit, Chinnan and Binfields. This is part of the ongoing, and then it moves on to some other, this was part of the ongoing County Council strategy for the past 3 decades. We actually asked them on this specific point what they held the land for, and they purchased it for development purposes.
That's not as clear as I'd like it to be, Chair, to be honest. The issue is interesting because here's County with a report, a strategic report on its land that it's got. It's confidential, it's secret. Councillor James has submitted a freedom of information request and has been refused. They won't tell us, they won't make it public, but it's there in black and white and it should be there for everybody to see, but they won't. It's interesting, I stand to be corrected, but I understand that the Cabinet member responsible is Councillor Stephen Reid. I'd like to stand to be corrected on that.
No, it isn't.
It isn't, interesting.
No,
so who is it? Is it the leader? Who is it, Mel Kendall?
That's what I'm being told.
Mel Kendall.
No, that's the officer telling me, so I have no personal knowledge.
So it's...
Well,
so under what...
I'm sure you'll get an email clarifying it.
I'm sure...
But it's not Councillor Reid, otherwise he'll be...
Well, but my point is, what portfolio is it being held at under the county? That's my point, because there's strategic land, there's transport by Mel Kendall. What are the county doing in terms of owning this site and the responsibility? And I think there's a lot of questions to be asked there. And I want it in writing. And to be fair, this report should be published. I mean, why are they sitting on it as if it substantiates the point? Second point relates to, if this land is being described, and backing up Councillor Watts' point, in terms of we look at many down as parcelled and look at this land as not, I think that's a genuine point that needs to go back and we need to be very carefully thought through. And I think in terms of the current position, I'm not comfortable supporting this site in the way that it's been brought forward. And finally, why, in this interesting point, why didn't Councillor Golding take it out last time round? What was the thought processes? What led to it being in the draft core strategy that was quashed? I think that's a very important point that we need to be... And also, to finish on, HCC have quite happily worked up a development brief. They've already done the development brief on this site. So I've got a lot of questions and a lot of issues with the way HCC are going about this that then put us, as this committee and this council, in a difficult position. And that's why I think the point about the ownership and the portfolio holder point, the political responsibility, is important.
Mr. Hunter, and could you, obviously I'm not expecting you to read Councillor Golding's mind and answer those questions, but can you answer the other points?
Just to say, I'm just looking back, it was the County Council's executive member for policy and resources, and the decision was taken on the 25th of October. So you'll be able to find out who that was. Is that Ken Thornber? Is that? Yeah.
Just for the record, Chair, shall we say that it was the leader that
Well,
took that
it
decision?
appears to be. Can I ask the officers this question? Because I've heard it said that there's a concern that the county councilman might be trying to develop it piecemeal, so they might not have to fulfil some of the obligations that might be expected if they developed it all in one go, such as schools and other infrastructure. In other words, if they develop a bit and they can say, well, that survived without a new school or without a new whatever it is, we'll just fill in the gap next time around.
I can't speculate. Simply, we've just been told that they're only promoting it and only promoting part for operational reasons. They haven't said any of those other things.
Miller?
It's getting quite confusing, isn't it? To say the least. Now, the other one is Redlands, which is Sol 02. Is that owned by the county council?
No, it's owned by an individual.
I would like to endorse my misgivings that the county council have. Now, let's get the words right. It's all available, but it's only site sufficient for 400 houses is being promoted. Is that true?
Yeah, that's my understanding. They're promoting part of, up to 400 homes within this plan period, and then the plan period beyond they would consider the next release.
Then, Chair, using, dare I say it, many down as an example, we can only consider 400 houses. We can't consider 900 because that's the same rules have got to be applied to every site, bearing in mind what the landowner wants to do. Unfortunately, it's the tail wagging the dog. Because unless we have unequivocal promotion from a landowner, how on earth can we do a strategic assessment of how many houses we're building in the borough? If it's a moving target, very difficult to do. By the way, I agree. Thank you to Mr. Hunters for reading out that letter from the county about the strategic availability and when they bought it. Because when we were looking at the original plan, a planning officer from county, that was down at Beacott, he showed me a map and described that was part of the original strategy for the Chinham Lichfield Basing area. But that was well over 30 years ago. I'm living in a house in Chinham that was built 32 years ago.
I think the officers might want to reply on one at a point, I've been told.
Just in terms of the money down point, I think that we've just got to be clear from that judgment is that we as a planning authority have to undertake the assessment. It's not for us to rely on what the landowners put forward, and that was the point last time, that if you're relying only on what the landowner says, then you can come unstuck. So we have to take what they've said but make our own assessment as a planning authority.
On that point, if that is the case in relation to the assessment that you have made about whether the land is required to be developed for housing, I'd like to see that, and I'm not sure in what you've read out is very clear, and therefore I would ask that as part of that assessment that you write to county and to clarify that more clearly as part of our assessment in this process. So I request that be done. I also would like to ask is, why is it, and I think I saw this back in 2008, I'm not absolutely sure what timescale, but it was about that time, I saw a development brief from county on this site, and I would just like to know from the borough who was aware of that development brief at that time, and has this committee seen that development brief? 2008. And so I'd quite like to know what officers saw that, what political members saw that, and has everybody here also seen that development brief? Because I think it's important that you've seen it, because it's quite a worked up document, and it came into my hands, and I don't think that all members of this committee actually were aware of it.
Mr. Hunter.
Just for everyone's memory, we did drop-in sessions on policies and particularly policies on sites. And I think at that meeting we shared the information that we'd received from various landowners with members who were interested in specific sites. So I think that that's at the point at which it was shared. We receive stuff from landowners all the time. You've received some of it through the emails that you've got before this committee today. But from my recollection, the information was provided to the members, the ward members particularly, in that location when we were talking about site policies.
If my memory, if I can remember, I think Councillor Miller hadn't seen it, and he was being bandied around as a development brief, and he raised it in an email of concern as to why there was a development brief, and he wasn't aware of it, and that's when it was shared. So I don't know if other members have seen it and would like to see it.
Just to say, it certainly isn't what we received. It certainly wasn't a development brief. It was simply a landowner submission to us as to how the site might be developed, and we certainly were quite happy to share that with members. And we did all those members who came to the site policy briefing were able to see that information.
Comments on this site, please, members?
Or does that mean that, could I ask that the officers share that development brief? I'd like to see it again, and maybe...
Well, Councillor James, Mr. Hunter will let you know when he's found it, and if it's something you've got to come in and see, or he can email you, whichever it is, they'll sort something. Yes, Councillor Miller.
Go back to the A33. The reason I asked the question about what parts of the site, and I'm glad we got an idea of what parts of the site, is that I've got a nasty feeling that, back to your comment of the reduced numbers, it may be that somebody at county will turn around and say, won't affect the transport on the A33. It certainly will. And I'd mentioned Redlands, because Redlands is due to come out at that little roundabout at the entrance to Taylor's Farm. It can't cope. If you build there, I don't care how many houses, we're talking about 400, and Sol 002 is how many? 150. That's 550 houses. That will necessitate major works on the A33 to even cope. If they try and push it through that lane that goes down through the incinerator, there's no hope that's ever going to work, bearing in mind the traffic that goes in there from the recycling plant for the incinerator and the sewage works. So notwithstanding a reduced number of houses, the A33 still got to be worked on. And I think it's taken as read, and I stand to be corrected, I really do. There is no way that the A33 will ever be dual carriageway. Now, if that's the case, I would love to see what mitigation is going to be presented, because the A33 is stressed right now. And that's why 121 has got to be out for me.
Can I add a couple of comments? The first one on the A33 seems to me to be correct, that the wider you make the A33, the more traffic will pour into it from further and further afield. And indeed, it's congestion which actually limits traffic from pouring onto it as it is. And so we're in the unenviable position of considering sites that are going to make its congestion worse, and there is no cure to that. There may be roundabouts that can be put in, stoplights that will slow everything down, but actually dualling it will never solve it, because more traffic will just pour on and pour out of Basingstoke. More people will say it's a shortcut to the M4 and the like. The second comment is this, another damned if you do, damned if you don't comment. It strikes me that any development of BAS 121 ought to be considered as the whole of the site for infrastructure reasons. And the local residents are caught between, on the one hand, not wanting any development, on the other hand, thinking, well, a little bit better than the full site, but knowing full well that an inch will end up as a mile. The whole lot will get developed if one corner gets developed. And so, to some extent, one has to consider the infrastructure needs and the overall plan for the whole of the site. even if for some bizarre reason, and I use that word advisedly, bizarre because it just seems to be odd, that the county are saying, well, actually, we don't want you to plan for the whole site, or if that is what they're saying. I would urge officers and the portfolio holder to this extent: if the site is out, it's out. But if the site is in, to urge the county to be committed to a development brief for the whole site, even if they only want to develop part of it. Because otherwise the schools, the roundabouts, the consequential thinking behind the impact of 900 homes will not be prepared for, and only the consequential thinking potentially for 400. That's all I would say. Mr. Brimacombe, I hope you caught that. Can you sum up, please, on that? And on Sol, anyone want to say anything else on Sol 002? Anything else on that? Okay, Mr. Brimacombe.
Again, focusing on the points that were made by more than one person. I've captured that there was concern about the different approach being taken between the landowner and the planning authority in relation to housing numbers on the site and the part of the site to be developed. And you would recommend that the Cabinet gets greater clarity on the county's decision and the rationale for that before making a decision on the site. I think that was the general consensus. I'm taking silence as agreement at this stage of the evening. And I believe more than one of you referred to transport and the A33 and the issues around that, the added congestion that it would make and the constraints on widening.
Councillor Ms. James.
Oh. So, was it also that we was asking county to confirm in writing to us the status of what the land was purchased for more clearly, and in relation to the assessment that we have carried out as planning authority?
Yeah, I meant that as part of the rationale, but I'll make that more transparent. So rationale and original purchase and original purpose for purchase.
Chairman, I feel sure that more than one of us said that we were against this site being left in the list at all. I see nods.
That's as a point of principle, not tied up with the clarity. So just as a point of principle, regardless of what comes back from county, is that what you're saying?
But it was also against all of the things, we said all the things before as to why we objected to it. And I read that out again, that whole list.
Sorry, I wasn't disputing that you did. I'd noted that, but it was just that it didn't seem to be picked up by anyone else. But if I'm wrong, that's fine.
Ditto, Chair.
Members, the final pair, if I can put them as a pair, is BAS 114 Kennel Farm and BAS 132 Basingstoke Golf Course. They're not exactly a pair, but they raise similar issues. BAS 114, I think, is the one that Mr. Paul Beavers has been raising issues with us about the concerns to the environment. Indeed, I think we've got a paper from him, which I certainly managed to pick up from the last group, which looked like that with all the ancient woodlands and the like and of course that is to the north of the Winchester Road, and the golf course is to the south. And I know that a number of representatives from the Dummer parish were discouraging the portfolio holder from developing that site. So, comments to the portfolio holder. Councillor Ms. James, and then Councillor Shaw. Councillor Taylor. Councillor Ms. James, off you go.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry, Chair.
Okay, mine's a political comment. We also had a comment last week from Councillor Rob Golding, who spoke against BS Basingstoke 132, the Basingstoke Golf Club. But again, at the time, he was a cabinet member at the cabinet meeting on the 23rd of January who proposed the draft course strategy, which included the Basingstoke Golf Club as a proposed site for development. At the meeting, he didn't speak against or vote against it. In fact, if you look at the Golf Shot magazine, he says in that Rob Golding is a cabinet member for infrastructure planning and transport, and he has commented, "We are, in quote, we are looking to develop new housing in the area, and finding sites for this is not always easy. We are very pleased that members of the golf club have voted to sell the land." I quote. Thank you.
Helpful and informative, Councillor James, because it doesn't help us one bit to determine whether this site is applicable, where another member thinks it is or it isn't. Have you got any further comments on this site that might assist this committee?
The one thing I would say is I don't remember what the gentleman who came to speak about, and I think it was Stafford Napier. Stafford Napier, he talked about the designer of the golf club. It was that this is a special designer that's got some status in, and I think yes, it's got some sort of special status in, and I think that is something we need to look at and make reference to. And does it make that reference in relation to the site assessment conclusions?
Well, there was a lady called a man called Julian Jones who came as well. Yes.
Yes, and it was on the golf course site specifically because one of the things that I want the plan that we put together to be is actually sort of, you know, a decent plan in terms of its deliverability and robustness and so on. And I'm not very convinced at the moment that including the golf course in the plan, you know, is suitably robust. Reason being that I can foresee a whole range of practical issues in terms of you know, time scales and the practicalities of you know, the members of the golf club not only, you know, selling the site but also identifying a developer, you know, getting a plan together in practice, planning application and so on, but also more crucially finding an alternative site for their golf course, which I would imagine, or I'm assuming, they would be required to do in order to get planning permission for housing on the site. Well, it'd be helpful to clarify that with officers, because I would have thought, isn't it the case that they need to demonstrate replacement provision?
Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we understand that the members of the golf club have voted in favour of moving forward with the local plan process, and indeed more recently they've submitted to us a framework of how they envisage a site could be delivered. It's quite a high-level document. In terms of replacing the existing golf course with a different facility elsewhere, we understand from the golf club that there is some capacity in other golf clubs within the Basingstoke area. And so they would put together a case to suggest that they wouldn't need to re-provide the site. They would merely take over and work with another club in the Basingstoke area.
Are they obliged to do that? That's the question. It's must they do it, or might they do it, or what's the position?
There is a policy in a safe policy in the existing local plan that seeks to protect and preserve existing community and recreational facilities. So I think a golf club would be included in that, and we'd test the proposals against that.
So, what would we do? Would we, as a council, say, well, that proposed alternative golf facility is as good as, or if not better? What if the officers took the view, based upon their knowledge of golf courses, that it wasn't as good? Would that be a reason for refusal?
I think ultimately it comes down to the provision point, and I think when we've talked to them before, they know of sites that are already available that they could move into, price being right. They also looked at what the sort of capacity. They made some quite strong comments back to us about there being quite a large provision of golf clubs in and around the Basingstoke area, which may fulfil the needs of their particular members. So I think that that's something that they would have to investigate as they move forward. So they talked about quite a large number of golf clubs in and around the area. Whether they all fall within Basingstoke and Dean is another question, but they certainly were looking at re-provision as a first step.
Councillor Shaw.
Yes, my understanding was that we'd got a report that our, leisure colleagues had produced that argued the case for there being a need for golf courses in the borough. And also, it does seem perverse to think that they could be allowed to get away with, just simply flogging the course for housing and not replacing it. Given that one of the sites that we've already got, housing going on now is what was previously a golf course in Park Pruitt. And, at a time when there seems to be, quite an interest in golf, quite a lot of enthusiasm for it. We suddenly find ourselves in a position where, one course is already gone because we didn't need that. Another is on the way out, apparently because there's no need for that either. And I'm unconvinced.
Not saying that there's not a need. I'm just simply reiterating what they've told us in terms of that. Obviously, it's not a public golf course; it's a members' golf course. So it's not open to all of us to go to that facility. It's a private one rather than a public one.
Harvey, I'm resisting the temptation to say private, so this is a good.
So am I. I was resisting saying something quite a lot there, and I stopped myself.
First of all, I think it's perhaps a little bit unfair to quote Councillor Golding, who isn't here to defend himself. This is a whole new set of proposals, and we have got to all look at them with fresh eyes, him and us included. Really, on these two subjects, I think Mr. Beavers has made a very good case for the Kennel Farm, and I honestly don't think I could probably add to that because he is the expert in such things. But I just want to put in a plea, please, and I know it's something Councillor Miller and others have said, that we do a serious assessment of our roads infrastructure before we do anything here. There's been a lot of housing in this southwest corner, as you see, that we've had Beggarwood, we've had Gabriel Park, Hatchwarren earlier, and that's put a lot of stress on Junction 7, and we know from something Mr. Napier said to us that the Highways Agency were firmly opposed to any development that would cause too much more traffic going south at Junction 7. It just cannot take it. And so I do think, obviously these two sites especially are going to churn out a lot onto Junction 7, probably be dormitory towns, to be honest. I don't know how many people will be working in Basingstoke. They'll all be shooting off the motorway. So that is just my plea, and also, of course, bearing in mind that if we do have a western bypass, that will also be churning a lot of traffic into Junction 7. So the roads are very important to look at before we do anything here. Thank
you. You would want the portfolio holder to do whatever he could to preserve the historic woodland and environment that Mr. Beavers has been alluding to.
Absolutely.
Bear in mind it's being chopped off in all over the place by the rest of the proposals that are in the plan.
Yes, and I think, we've got to look at Basingstoke's reputation and standing. If we chop up their ancient woodlands, if we even get rid of their private golf courses, which does give a certain standing and reputation to Basingstoke, we've always got to look at that because we're a little bit vulnerable in that area, and I think it's important to keep considering our atmosphere.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think the points made by the people from Dummer, obviously, what they're obviously concerned is that with the golf course going, that the development will be next on them. I mean, to a certain, they got the separation of the M3, but as I said, Basingstoke is in a very odd shape, but it's particularly odd in this area, and also the distance. I think it's nearly 4 miles to this. If you were to put a compass in Festival Place on this map and draw a sort of ideal town shape, this is nowhere close to it. I mean, certainly Beggarwood, even parts of Hatchwarren are on the periphery, aren't they? And that's where you end up with like a district centre. But by the time you get out to Beggarwood, that's too far, and the golf course is just adding to that. You're getting this sort of tapering down to a point down there, driven by the roads there. So, and obviously, as we say, Bramley's just off the map that way, but so is Dummer and that way. I mean, you're just sort of starting to turn them into the edge of that. And at the end of the day, the golf course, the members will, I think they voted with their feet, basically, haven't they? They don't think there's a need for a golf course. There's a need for a lot of money in their bank accounts, isn't it? So, but that's up to them. They own it. They can do what they like. So, and there is a golf course next door as well, which I'd always assumed that when that was built, was it 20 odd years ago, about the time there was talk of building on the golf course then. I mean, this is not something that's come up recently. Once Warren started spreading up that way, there was talk of building on there. I'd always assumed that was part of that was done to sort of they could move over, although it's not owned by the same people, I understand. So there is additional provision there, but there is provision in the area for golf. So at the end of the day, if the people who own it don't want to play golf on there or would rather go somewhere else, that's up to them. It's not, as Andrew said, it's not publicly owned. It's not a public facility, although it serves it's a green space. So it is in that respect, it's an amenity, but not one we share. But then you could argue Bramley camps that as well, but with explosions.
Please, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Taylor's made the same sort of points I was going to make. Goes in the report about Anson Fields in the southwestern corridor, and that's adjacent to Kennel Farm. I think that's potential for extra housing as well. I think we should take the consequences of that as well on the infrastructure. And also I would endorse Mr. Beaver, his proposals that having a 50-metre barrier around the ancient woodland of Kennel Farm and Houndsmill Fields as well, if that was to go ahead. I mean, I know the area quite well because I live up that way, and I walk the dog up there, and it's a beautiful area, and I think we should look to build some protections up there. Thank you.
Councillor Harvey.
Thanks, Chair. Just two quick points in relation to page 104. The site assessment talks about high quality agricultural land and also talks about major infrastructure is required to convey the sewage effluent to the treatment works, and further investigations are required into this, as good substantive reasons for at least seriously considering the site. And I did note, looking at the map, the Old Park Pruitt golf course is inside Basingstoke settlement policy boundary, and it's the consequential action of putting this golf course inside the boundary again. So it's just that notion of the changing shape of Basingstoke, and those golf courses which we've already accepted will get built on. So again, it's the leisure provision, as the officers have said in the report, exists.
Comments on this site or the other site, the Kennel Farm over the way? Okay, can I ask? Oh, Councillor Tillman.
Yeah, so probably on the 114, the obvious thing with that is the obvious separation from anything there. There's a large gap there between that and anything closer. I think it may be topographical, but it's just a completely isolated development, isn't it, on its own? It just seems a bit of an oddity there. It may be nice because if you had woods either side, but obviously there isn't there. There's just. It just seems like it's sort of stuck. It's not usually you build next to the settlement boundaries. Well, there's just a great big gap there, isn't there? But I think part of that is because there's there's the open park on the other side. But again, it's going to be isolated there unless of course you're planning to carry on at the other side, opposite the golf course, which that's it. And again, I think there is a proposal for that, but it's just very bitty, isn't it?
The points I have in common there are the concern in relation to BAS 132 about the loss of leisure provision, i.e. golf. There seemed to be general agreement about Mr. Beaver's point about wanting a 50-metre barrier around any development around ancient woodlands. Is that right? And in relation to BAS 114, I know there wasn't more than one person spoke, but you all seem to be nodding in agreement that there was some concern there around isolation of that site from anything else. And I'm really sorry to do this, but can I just confirm on the last sites that we considered, because you made lots of comments and said that BAS 121 should come out. Did that also relate to SOL 002 or? It's not the fact that it's for the same reasons, it's that without BAS 121, SOL 002 doesn't stand can't stand in isolation.
James. Councillor Miss James.
It was just also that I did raise the status of the golf course itself, and that was raised by members of the public. I think it is important. Yeah. But it's also the other thing that I think is important, and it was raised, is about the leisure report in relation to the status of golf clubs courses in Basingstoke. And if members haven't seen that, you should see that report, and maybe the officers should send you that, and what it says about golf courses, because we clearly have a policy, as do we, in relation to hotels, etc. So do get the officers to send you that. And the other one that Councillor Harvey raised was about the agricultural land status.
Generally supportive of that from the committee, the agricultural land status? Please say yes or no. Yes.
Councillor Gary Watts.
Location on BAS 133, Wholesome Fields, which is next to Kennel Farm, that's not in this particular plan. I presume that's going to be in the next one. That's why it's mentioned in the Western Corridor.
133 is not in consideration. It's not a site.
Good. Clarify.